Anime autopsy here, and we need to have a conversation about Joy Boy, because somewhere along the way the community collectively decided that Joy Boy failed his promise is just a canon, uncontested, written in stone fact. People say it with their whole chest, no hesitation, no asterisk, no according to who. And listen to me, that is wild. Scroll through Twitter for 5 minutes and you'll see it. Thread after thread, using Joy Boy as a punchline for tragic incompetence. Power scaling videos going, well, Joy Boy fumbled the bag, but Luffy won't. Comment sections under Fishman Island clips with the same tired joke. Imagine being so bad at promises they have to reincarnate you 800 years later. It's turned into this meme category of guy who meant well but blew it, and everyone just moved on. Here's the thing. When you casually label Joy Boy as a failure, you're not just misreading one character beat, you are flattening the single darkest, most loaded mystery in the entire story into a self-owned gag. Because the text we actually have does not read, Joy Boy was too weak. It reads, Joy Boy apologized. That is a different sentence. That is a different story. We have an apology carved into an indestructible stone, in a dead language, about a broken promise tied to an ancient weapon and an entire oppressed race. That is not the footprint of a guy who just forgot to set an alarm. That is the footprint of someone who got kneecapped at the finish line and wanted the future to know it. And I say this with love. I say this as someone who has spent an embarrassing amount of adult life zooming in on Poneglyph panels, cross-referencing SBS answers, and reading Oda interviews in translation chains, so sketchy they might as well be a game of telephone run by a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast. This is not me doing a late-night headcanon rant. This is me telling you the author has given us enough foreshadowing to at least question the Joy Boy just failed narrative. Because once you bring in the Void Century, the Ancient Kingdom, the D-Clan, the world government erasing islands off the map, the Nika fruit that keeps evading them for centuries, the Poneglyphs recorded by people who might have been in on the crime, the more intentional and planned this all looks, the less honest that word failure feels. Calling Joy Boy a failure is easy. This is fine. This is normal. We love clean categories. But what if the real problem is that Joy Boy didn't fail his promise at all? What if someone made sure he couldn't keep it, then wrote the history so you would blame him instead of them? I need you to sit with that, because by the end of this video you will not be able to look at the Fishman Island apology, the Void Century, or Luffy's supposed second coming of Joy Boy roll the same way again. So let's actually spell out the Joy Boy failed story the way the community usually runs it. Joy Boy shows up during the Void Century, makes a grand promise to Fishman Island, something involving Noah and the mermaid princess of that era, and then doesn't do it. He screws up. He leaves a written apology on a poneglyph. End of story. Open and shut case, Your Honor. Guilty of breaking his word. That reading feels clean. It feels tidy. It gives you a neat little moral fable about overpromising and under-delivering, and then you can move on to arguing about power scaling. This is fine. This is normal. But here's the thing. That entire interpretation quietly assumes Joy Boy was in full control of the situation. It assumes he had the freedom to act, the time to execute, and just didn't. Almost no one stops and asks, wait, what actually stopped him? When you treat that apology as a confession instead of as evidence, you flatten the Void Century into background wallpaper. You ignore that this is the same 100-year stretch where an entire ancient kingdom is erased. The D-Clan is systematically hunted, and the world government is born out of a war so brutal they will still murder an island centuries later to keep it quiet. And we're really going, yeah, Joy Boy probably just flaked. I need you to hear how wild that is. We are talking about a period where the authors of history are literally executing historians. Poneglyphs exist precisely because the people on Joy Boy's side knew their enemies would control the narrative. So when you see an apology carved in indestructible stone, The question is not just what did he do wrong? The smarter question is, who forced him into a position where apologizing was the only thing he could still do? This is where the darker alternative comes in. What if Joy Boy didn't fail because he was weak or indecisive, but because someone yanked the floor out at the exact critical moment? Not a random meteor, not bad weather. A person, a government, a supposed ally civilization that had every reason to smile to his face while sharpening the knife behind his back. We need to entertain the category of betrayal here, because the pattern is everywhere. The ancient weapons are world-shaking tools, and Joy Boy's promise is tied directly to Poseidon. The Nika fruit is intentionally hidden, renamed, hunted, and yet somehow keeps slipping away. The D clan keeps inheriting a will that terrifies the same institution that supposedly saved the world. History is clearly being curated, which means every surviving scrap is suspicious by default. And remember, the only version of Joy Boy you have is what survived a century of deliberate erasure, filtered through poneglyphs and the regime that tried to destroy them. If he was just some guy who messed up a promise, if he's basically ancient era Usopp, biting off more than he can chew, then riddle me this. Why did the world government need to nuke an entire century of history just to make sure you never learn what really happened on the day Joy Boy failed Fishman Island? So here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to stare at that Fishman Island apology, shrug, and say, wow, Joy Boy fumbled the bag for 2.5 hours. I respect your time more than that, and also my own sanity. This is a long video. This is a 2 hours plus, get a drink, grab a snack, maybe do the dishes while you listen situation. This is normal. This is fine. Long doesn't mean rambling. Long means we're actually going to build a case instead of doing the usual Twitter thread where someone posts a panel from Sky PA next to a panel from Egghead and declares Oda planned this 25 years ago with zero evidence. So, thesis on the table, very clean. Joy Boy did not simply fail. He was playing a game that was already rigged, with rules written by people who intended to betray him, and the text of One Piece, across Poneglyph's Void Century hints and world government behaviour, keeps quietly screaming that at you. Luffy is not just the guy who won't fail this time. He is re-entering the exact same rigged game with a different win condition and a different set of tools. To get there without turning into a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Joy Boy's face in every stone carving, we need a framework. First, I'm going to teach you how to read long-term storytelling in One Piece as a system, not a miracle. We'll redefine foreshadowing, separate it from retrofitting, and then introduce a third category that matters way more here, pre-writing. Because if you don't know which category you're looking at, you can't tell whether Joy Boy's failure was planned tragedy, accidental plot hole, or deliberate narrative misdirection. From there, we're going arc by arc and poneglyph by poneglyph. Sky Pier Bells, Fishman Islands Noah, Zeus Road Poneglyph, Wano's Ancient Kingdom Echoes. I need you to see how the apology, the ancient weapons, and the will of D are threaded through the story as a single conversation about a promise that someone wanted to break and then bury. We'll end by zooming out to the final war and asking, what does it mean if the original Joy Boy was sabotaged at the finish line and Luffy knows it when he reaches Laugh Tale? Here's the thing. You've heard Oda is a genius planner so often it's become background radiation. I'm not just repeating that. I'm using a 3-part model: foreshadowing, retrofitting, pre-writing, to sort what was intentionally planned, what was cleverly repurposed, and where Joy Boy's story actually lives inside that machine. This is not a sin. This is not me accusing the author of cheating. This is me showing you how the writing really works. And yes, we're doing receipts. Specific panels, SBS quotes, publication context. When I say the Nika fruit being hidden by the world government reframes Joy Boy's failure, I will show you the print, the dates, the interviews, The goal is not just to convince you he was betrayed. The goal is to hand you a toolkit so that when the next chapter drops, you can run this same analysis on whatever bomb Oda throws at us next. By the end, if I've done my job, you won't just have a new Joy Boy theory. You'll have a new way of reading One Piece. And here's where we hit a wall. Because if we're going to claim Joy Boy didn't fail, he was betrayed, we can't do that while speaking in fandom baby talk. We throw around words in this community the way Luffy throws punches. Constantly, enthusiastically, with zero regard for what they actually hit. Foreshadowing. Planned from day one. Oda is a genius. These terms get spammed under every panel of a shadowy silhouette or a round sun. And listen to me, if those words don't mean anything specific, then Joy Boy was betrayed doesn't mean anything specific either. Here's the thing, when you call every coincidence foreshadowing, you accidentally turn Oda into a time-traveling god and erase the actual craft he's using. Foreshadowing, in the strict sense, is intentional. The author knows the payoff, plants a seed early, and pays it off later. The Fishman Island Poneglyph that literally says Joy Boy and apologizes for a broken promise tied to Noah and the mermaid princess, that smells intentional. That's not Oda waking up during Wano and going, oh, I guess that apology was about a cool boat. But when the community slaps the same label on every sundoodle, every smile, every drumbeat, we overcredit omniscient planning and undercredit what Oda is actually a monster at: flexibility, improvisation, controlled ambiguity. The man leaves doors open. He writes details that can bend. Then, 10 years later, he walks back into an old room and decides which door to lock in. This is not a sin. This is normal. This is how long-running storytelling survives. The problem is that Joy Boy's entire story has been swallowed by this definitional mush. Every vague hint about the Void Century, every mention of the D, every panel of an ancient weapon gets immediately filed under 4D chess from Chapter 1. Poseidon being a mermaid princess, planned from day one. The Nika fruit dodging the world government for centuries, planned from day one. Imu erasing Lulusia to hide history. See, Oda foreshadowed Joy Boy's failure back in Skype here. Did he? Or are we being pattern-seeking monkeys who see Jesus in toast and call it as SBS confirmation? Pattern interrupt. What if most of what you're calling foreshadowing isn't? What if it's a different category of writing entirely? I need you to sit with that, because the next few sections are going to do something very un-YouTube. We're going to build a simple but strict framework. 3 categories. 1 for true foreshadowing, 1 for retrofitting, 1 for the pre-written endgame that sits underneath both. Then we're going to march Joy Boy's promise, the Void Century and Luffy's inheritance into that framework and see where each piece actually lands. If you stick with those definitions, the betrayal argument at the end won't feel like a galaxy brain theory. It'll feel boring in the best way. A logical conclusion about how this author actually writes. Negative, foreshadowing, retrofitting, prue-writing. The 3 tools you need so to do that without all of us turning into that pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast every time Oda draws a circle. We need a cleaner toolkit. We need 3 boxes on the table, and I need you to actually use the right box when you talk about Joy Boy. Category 1, foreshadowing. Classical, boring English teacher foreshadowing. That's when an author intentionally plants something early with a specific payoff already nailed down. The key word is intentional. You don't just toss a gun on the mantle because guns are cool. You put the gun there because in your outline, in your brain, in your notes, someone is absolutely getting shot in Act 3. It's a preloaded bullet. The setup exists because the later moment already exists. Category 2, retrofitting. This is when an author goes back to an earlier detail that did not have a fixed meaning, and later assigns it 1, so it looks planned. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is in fact how most long serial storytelling survives past Volume 3. You wrote a random side gag with a dragon. 2 years later, you realize, oh, that can be Wono trauma. That can be a samurai's failure. That can be a bridge into a whole arc. You're reusing a prop for a new scene. Same object, new function, sold to the audience as destiny. Now, here's the thing. Those two categories are not enough to explain Oda, because when fans scream, he planned this 25 years ago, and other fans scream, no, it's all retrofitted. Both sides are only holding half the elephant. So I'm adding a third category, pre-writing. Pre-writing is the weird middle ground Oda seems to live in. It's when an author has already decided the big answers, the ending, the core mysteries, before chapter 1 ever hit the magazine, but hasn't necessarily mapped every step of the journey. Instead of foreshadowing in the neat Chekhov sense, he's scattering puzzle pieces all over the floor without fully locking which exact picture they'll form. The pieces are real. The final image is real. The path from pile to picture is flexible. So if foreshadowing is a preloaded bullet and retrofitting is reusing a prop for a new scene, pre-writing is dumping 1,000 puzzle pieces onto the table and only later deciding which box art you're committing to. The gun exists because you already wrote the shooting. The prop exists because you already know the play's ending. The puzzle pieces exist because the author has a secret blueprint you don't get to see. And Joy Boy's supposed failure, that whole narrative sits right at the intersection of all three. Some parts of his promise are foreshadowed in a brutally direct way. Some parts are almost certainly retrofits, dressed up as fate. And a terrifying amount of it smells like pre-writing. When you mislabel which is which, you end up with terrible takes about Joy Boy being incompetent instead of betrayed. So next, we're going to walk through that promise, piece by piece, and start sorting. So before we start accusing Joy Boy of being the galaxy's worst promise keeper, we need to talk about expectations. Specifically, the incredibly cursed expectations that the community has imported from textbook writing advice into weekly manga chaos. Chekhov's gun is the clean version. In the classical formulation, if you hang a gun on the wall in Act 1, it should be fired by Act 3. Foreshadowing in that model is elegant, minimal, intentional. You only show the audience what matters. You plant the seed because you already know the exact flower that's going to bloom, and you're writing in a contained space where Act 3 is what? 40 pages away. Here's the thing. That's theatre. That's short fiction. That's a 2-hour film with a locked script. You can have the gun, the firing, and the fallout all planned in a single document. You're not dodging reader surveys and editorial meetings and annual popularity polls while you do it. Think about a movie example. In a tight thriller, you see a close-up on a character locking a specific red toolbox in the first 10 minutes. You forget it. 90 minutes later, that same toolbox is the only thing that can wedge a door and save the protagonist. Perfect. Clean. You can point to frame 1 and frame 2 and go, foreshadowing. Now compare that to One Piece. Compare that to a story where the toolbox is a single apology etched on a stone at the bottom of the sea, and the payoff involves Fishman Island, Poseidon being a mermaid princess, Noah's Ark, the Void Century, and a rubber idiot who won't even be born for 800 years. That payoff doesn't happen in 90 minutes. It happens in hundreds of chapters across console generations, while the author is aging in real time. Weekly manga is not Chekhov's gun. Weekly manga is Chekhov's entire armory being wheeled on stage over 25 years while the audience screams suggestions. You have constant deadlines. You have editors saying, can we move this reveal up? You have reader surveys threatening to kill your favourite side character if their popularity dips. A rigid 25-year plan survives contact with that reality, about as well as a marine battleship survives contact with Whitebeard's fist. So when fans demand that every Joy Boy hint be a perfectly pre-planned Chekhov's gun, that every panel from Chapter 1 be a smoking gun for Chapter 1100, I need you to understand how unrealistic that is. Oda is a monster of planning, yes, but he's also a human running a marathon while juggling knives. This is where retrofitting and pre-writing stop being dirty words and start being survival tools. You pre-write the big pillars: Joy Boy, the Void Century, the ancient weapons, the end of the Great Pirate Era. Then, as serialization mutates around you, you retrofit smaller details so they snap into those pre-written slots. This is not a sin. This is normal. This is how you get something that feels impossibly cohesive without the author needing prophetic powers. And listen to me, because this is the pivot for Joy Boy. Until you accept that one piece is built in this storm, half pristine blueprint, half controlled improvisation, you can't answer the real question. Was Joy Boy's failure always planned as a tragic betrayal? Was it an improvised twist Oda discovered on the way? Or is the apology itself a retrofitted cover story for something much darker? We need to walk into that mystery with the right model of the gun cabinet, or we're going to misread the crime scene. So before we kick down the door marked Joy Boy was betrayed, we need to fix a vocabulary problem the community keeps tripping over. Because if every cool payoff is foreshadowing and every contradiction is plot hole, you're going to misdiagnose what Oda is actually doing, and you're going to misread Joy Boy's so-called failure. Here's the thing. Retrofitting is not the same category as foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is intentional setup for a payoff the author already knows. Retrofitting is when the author looks back at something unresolved, vague, or just aesthetically cool, and decides later to weld a new revelation onto it so it feels planned. The early piece wasn't a loaded gun. It was just an object in the room that later got turned into a gun. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is, in fact, how most long stories stay alive. An author notices an old detail, an offhanded line, a background figure, a weird symbol, and realizes, oh, if I connect the new theme to that, it'll hit 10 times harder. That's not lying to you. That's using the existing geometry of the story to create resonance. Let me give you a clean example, so we're not just waving theory around. Imagine an early arc where there's a bartender in one panel, no name, no dialogue, just pouring a drink while the real scene happens in front. Zero planned role. Years later, the author decides the main character needs a mentor figure with a shady past in this exact town. Instead of inventing a new guy, they go back, grab that bartender and declare, actually, that was the retired assassin all along. If the bartender's design doesn't contradict anything, if his personality and actions line up with what we've seen, that retrofit will feel organic. To you, the reader, it is indistinguishable from foreshadowing. You will swear it was planned. You will make 15-minute TikToks about the genius of panel 3. Meanwhile, the author is at their desk, pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in Toast in reverse, going, oh wow, I accidentally set that up. Retrofitting only feels bad when it breaks established facts or character logic. When the assassin bartender suddenly has powers that would have solved 3 previous crises, or a personality that clashes with every earlier scene, your brain revolts. That's when fans yell, retcon, and patching plot holes later. The problem isn't the retrofit. The problem is the contradiction. Now, listen to me, because this is where Joy Boy sneaks back in. A lot of what the community calls Joy Boy foreshadowing might actually be retrofits or slow-motion pre-writing that Oda shaped over time. The Fishman Island apology, the Noah, the Mermaid Princess, the Nika imagery, even how the Poneglyphs frame his failure as a broken promise. Those may not all have been born fully formed in Chapter 1, and that matters. Because if some of Joy Boy's tragedy is a retrofit, then Oda is choosing right now to reinterpret that ancient event as betrayal instead of incompetence. The story is actively deciding what kind of crime scene we're looking at. In the next section, I need you to walk with me through the Void Century evidence and ask who had the motive to stab Joy Boy in the back, which means we need a new tool. Because if you walk into the Void Century crime scene with only foreshadowing and retrofitting in your little fandom toolbox, you're going to mislabel half the evidence. So I'm calling it pre-writing. And listen to me, I know that is not a formal academic term. No professor is out here assigning you a paper on Oda's pre-writing praxis. This is fine. This is normal. I'm not trying to win a Nobel. I'm trying to explain why your brain keeps short-circuiting when you see a panel from chapter 100 pay off in chapter 1000. And you go, he planned this from birth. Here's the thing. Foreshadowing, in the strict sense, is when an author intentionally plants a detail because they already know the exact payoff. Retrofitting is when they go back mentally and assign new meaning to an old detail. Pre-writing sits in the middle. Pre-writing is when an author deliberately scatters motifs, names, symbols and half-formed ideas into the story knowing they're important, but without locking in the precise shape of the reveal yet. The gun is on the mantle because you've decided there will be a shooting. You just haven't decided who pulls the trigger or who gets hit. That's pre-writing. It's not random. It's not pure improvisation. It's a planned field of landmines where the exact explosion pattern is still negotiable. Take the ancient weapons. From very early on, Oda is dropping the words Pluton, Poseidon, Uranus. These aren't throwaway names. They're branded into the lore. But did he already have Shirahoshi's exact personality written when he first wrote Poseidon on a poneglyph? No. What he had was a pre-written slot, ancient weapon that talks to sea kings, tied to the seafloor, critical for the final war. The details could flex, the category could not. Same with the D, initial. Same with the blank century. These are not clean, surgical foreshadowing setups where every beat was storyboarded in 1997. They're heavy, intentional concepts Oda knew would anchor the endgame, refined over time as he found better angles, better metaphors, better ways to torture us. And this is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is how you survive a 25-year realization without your brain melting out of your ears. Pre-writing gives Oda flexibility. He can respond to new ideas, editorial panic, reader reactions, and still maintain the illusion that everything was one 4D chess move from the start. The community sees a panel match and goes galaxy brain foreshadowing. Oda sees a box he left open for himself and goes, oh good, I can use that. Now here's where Joy Boy walks back on stage. Joy Boy's apology on the Fishman Island Poneglyph, the Noah Ark parked under the island, the Mermaid Princess prophecy about guiding the world. These feel like classic Oda pre-writing. Big, loaded concepts. Not fully solved equations. What I need you to consider is that those early pieces weren't originally about failure at all. They were pre-written anchors that later got fused with a much darker betrayal narrative once Oda sharpened his view of the Void Century. And in the next section, we're going to line up those anchors and ask who weaponized them against Joy Boy. And to answer that question, we need to kill a sacred cow in this community. The myth of Oda had every Joy Boy detail planned from chapter 1 is comforting. It makes the story feel ordained, inevitable, almost religious. But listen to me. The logistics do not support a 1000 chapter, zero improvisation master spreadsheet. That's not storytelling. That's a hostage situation with a calendar. Weekly serialization is brutal. 19 pages every 7 days for 20 plus years, while drawing, drafting, revising, doing meetings and occasionally remembering that sleep is a mechanic in real life. Oda has had surgeries, hospitalizations, mandatory breaks. He has to hit volume deadlines, magazine slots, anime coordination. You do not sit down at 22 and perfectly blueprint every Joy Boy nuance, every Void Century beat, every ancient weapon reveal, and then just calmly execute for 3 decades. That's not a human author, that's a malicious time god. And then you add editorial pressure. Shonen Jump is not a monastery, it's a popularity blood sport. You've got reader polls, volume sales, anime ratings, merch. An arc catches fire. The editor says, "Can we stay here a bit longer?" An arc underperforms. Suddenly the pacing hits fast forward. Characters get promoted from gag to core cast because fans won't shut up about them. Others quietly vanish. This is normal. This is not a sin. This is how commercial writing works. Here's the thing. If you want perfect pre-planned Joy Boy, you're basically asking Oda to have predicted 25 years of market trends, editorial shuffles, his own health issues, and the global reception to every single arc. No missteps. No rewrites. No, "Oh, that idea's better. Let me bend this setup toward it." That's not foreshadowing anymore. That's prophecy. So when fans insist, with religious fervor, that every panel about Joy Boy, Nika, the Ancient Kingdom, the D-Clan, the Poneglyphs was locked in stone in 1997, they accidentally erase Oda's actual skill. The genius isn't that he never changed his mind. The genius is that he could adapt. He could take early anchors, Joy Boy's apology, Fishman Island, ancient weapons, and as priorities shifted and new themes emerged, reweave them into a denser tapestry without snapping the threads. We need to stop treating Oda adjusted the Joy Boy narrative over time as heresy. It's craft. It's him looking at what the story is becoming, what the world is saying back to him, and then sharpening the Void Century and Joy Boy's role so the emotional math still balances. This is fine. This is how you turn a good outline into a living myth. And once you accept that, another door opens. If Joy Boy's story wasn't a rigid, pre-written, he failed the end, but a flexible skeleton Oda kept upgrading, then the shift toward betrayal, towards sabotage, cover-up, weaponized history, stops being a wild theory and starts being the most efficient retrofit imaginable. Because if he's revising the equation, the missing variable becomes obvious. Who exactly had the power to rewrite Joy Boy into a failure? So when we ask, who rewrote Joy Boy into a failure, we need to zoom out from the lore board and look at the factory that produces this stuff in the first place. Because here's the thing. The average mangaka is not a cloaked chess grandmaster in a candlelit room, stroking a cat and plotting a 20-year betrayal twist. The average mangaka is a sleep-deprived gremlin on a monthly treadmill, drafting next chapter, storyboarding rough layouts, inking until their hand hates them, quick meeting with the editor, rewrite the scene the editor didn't like, fix the crowd shot because an assistant got sick, repeat. Where in that cycle are you imagining the 6-hour Joy Boy Betrayal Symposium is happening? A typical month is survival mode. You submit named drafts, your editor pushes back on pacing, you adjust the emotional beats, and somewhere in there you remember to eat food that isn't instant noodles. Meanwhile, the magazine is breathing down your neck about rankings. Fans vote, reader surveys come in, trends shift. Suddenly that side character you tossed in as comic relief is more popular than your protagonist. That arc you thought would be 4 chapters is dragging at 12. That theme you planned as a background note is resonating so hard the community won't shut up about it. So what does an author do? They adapt. They have to. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is normal serialized storytelling under capitalism. If a character spikes in popularity, you expand them. If an arc is tanking, you compress or pivot. If a mystery hits harder than expected, you elevate it. You don't get points for clinging to the initial plan while your series quietly dies. And that pressure creates a very specific survival instinct. You start leaving yourself escape hatches, vague histories, half-told legends, mysterious figures in silhouette, prophecies that sound specific but aren't actually nailed down yet. You sketch the outline of a Joy Boy, an ancient promise, an apology on a poneglyph, but you very intentionally do not lock every detail in stone on day one, because you know future. You will need room to maneuver. Pattern interrupt. The gun on the mantelpiece. In weekly manga, Half the time, the author hasn't even decided if it's a gun, a water pistol, or a metaphor yet. They just know something is going to go off here. Retrofitting in that environment isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's the survival strategy that lets Oda respond to reader feedback, editorial pressure, and his own evolving ideas without the story collapsing. And his particular genius is how seamlessly he folds those adjustments back into the mythos, so it still feels intentional, still feels planned, still reads as foreshadowing instead of patchwork. So the Joy Boy legend, that's a perfect escape hatch, a promise, an apology, a missing context. The real question for our purposes isn't, did Oda always plan Joy Boy's betrayal, as if there was a single sacred notebook from 1997? It's much sharper. At what point in this meat grinder did he decide that betrayal, not failure, was the right lens to retrofit onto that ancient promise? So before we start accusing Oda of being a prophet or a scam artist about Joy Boy, we need to do something very boring and very important. Define our terms. I need you to resist the urge to point at a random panel, squint, and yell foreshadowing the way a pattern-seeking monkey sees Jesus in toast. Here's the thing. Foreshadowing, in the strict sense, is not an old panel that happens to line up later. Foreshadowing is when an author intentionally plants information early because the payoff is already planned at the time of writing. The setup exists because the ending scene is sitting there in the outline, staring at it. Cause and effect, not the other way around. So, simple 3-act example. Act 1, a character tosses off a line. Heights freak me out, while they're joking around on a rooftop. It reads as flavor. You move on. Act 3, same character is hanging from a collapsing bridge, paralyzed, about to drop their best friend. The entire climax is built around that fear and their decision to act anyway. Real foreshadowing means that first rooftop line was written with that exact bridge scene already in the author's head. They didn't discover the fear later. They were aiming at that moment from page 1. Most competent authors do this constantly. Short-term, mid-term, all over the place. This is not a sin. This is not magical. This is basic storytelling craft. You see motivations, weaknesses, objects, relationships, so that when Act 3 explodes, it feels earned instead of pulled out of a hat by a desperate magician who just realized they forgot to buy rabbits. And because it's basic, it's everywhere. The gun on the mantle in Chapter 2 that fires in Chapter 10, the offhand mention of a sick mother that becomes the reason a character takes the dangerous job. Fans spot these and go, wow, foreshadowing. The author goes, yeah, I wrote the ending first. This is normal. Now, in a short story or a single novel, it's easy to say, that's foreshadowing. The whole thing was written in one continuous process. But in a monster-long series, across decades, suddenly the question of intent gets way messier. We need to ask, was this detail actually planned from the start? Or did the author retrofit meaning onto an old panel once they had a new idea? In those cases, we can only be confident about foreshadowing if we have external evidence. Interviews, drafts, author notes, or if the structure is so tight, so interlocked, that improvisation would be statistically insane. Otherwise, you're just doing literary astrology. Which brings us back to One Piece. When we stare at Joy Boy's apology on Fishman Island, the Mermaid Princess prophecy, the scattered Void Century hints, we have to sort them. What's true foreshadowing, born from a pre-written endgame, and what's later reinterpretation, clever but fundamentally retrofitted. Listen to me. That distinction is the whole ballgame for deciding whether Joy Boy failed or was always meant to be the victim of a betrayal Oda had planned years in advance. And here's where the whole thing goes off the rails for the community. Because once you start sorting, once you start saying this is real foreshadowing, this is retrofit, your brain does what human brains always do. It panics and starts seeing patterns in everything. We are pattern-seeking monkeys. That's the job. Your brain is a little conspiracy theorist that evolved to connect rustling grass to tiger so you didn't die. Great for survival. Terrible for reading weekly manga without losing your mind. So what happens? You stare at One Piece, this 25-year brick of dense, overlapping motifs, and suddenly every circle is the sun, every smile is Nika, every apology is Joy Boy whispering from the grave. You start seeing Jesus in toast. You burn a piece of bread. The scorch mark vaguely resembles a beard, and boom, divine revelation, sell it on eBay. In our space, the Jesus in toast moment is when fans grab a single panel and declare it a grand intentional key to the void century. You know the posts. Oda drew a round window behind Luffy's head in chapter 30. Therefore he planned the sun god reveal from day one. Or, this random festival lantern is actually a secret Nika silhouette. I need you to hear me. Sometimes a circle is just a circle. Sometimes the author just thinks the sun looks cool. Here's the thing. Recurring sun imagery before Nika is a perfect example of this problem. Yes, there are absolutely planned structural sun motifs tied to Skypiea, Shandora, and the Drums of Liberation. But there are also 100 generic sunrise over the sea shots that are just manga shorthand for hope. When you grab every single one and staple it to a Joy Boy theory, you flatten the categories. You erase the difference between an intentional symbol and a stock image. Another harmless case. People pointing at every mermaid panel before Fishman Island and yelling, "See? Oda was foreshadowing Shirahoshi as Poseidon from chapter 1. No, he was drawing a world with fish people in it. This is not a sin. This is not bad analysis. This is normal overexcitement from fans who care too much. But if everything is proof, then nothing is. And that's where the author turns into an infallible oracle in people's heads. If you treat every coincidence as planned, Oda stops being a meticulous planner and becomes a literal prophet who encoded the Nika fruit in the way Luffy bites meat. Once you do that, you can't see the actual craft anymore. You can't distinguish the real Joy Boy scaffolding from the noise your own brain is generating. So in this video, we need to do something harder. We need to stop being impressed by toast. I'm going to separate the genuine, structural clues about betrayal, the stuff that requires pre-writing, from the static of overexcited pattern recognition. Because once you strip out the fake foreshadowing, what's left about Joy Boy's failure is way more targeted, way more intentional, and way more damning than the community usually admits. So before I start poking at Joy Boy and Oda and the Void Century, I need you to unclench your shoulders. We're going to Naruto for a second. We're going to do this in a safer sandbox where your parasocial attachment to an author isn't on fire. Toby, masked clown, spiral mask, goofy voice. I'm just a silly subordinate of the real villain. Don't worry about me. And then years later, the mask cracks and suddenly his Obito Kakashi's dead childhood friend, crushed under a boulder, rescued by Madara, turned into the architect of the Fourth Ninja War. Overnight, the community retroactively goes, "Oh my God, it was obvious." Because on paper, it does look obvious. One eye showing, same side of the face Obito lost, the mask pattern vaguely echoing his old goggles. Toby fixating on Kakashi, on the Sharingan, on the past. Little lines about "you let Rin die," cryptic comments about an earlier generation's failure. If you're already convinced, every swirl on that mask starts to feel like 4D chess foreshadowing. Except, here's the thing. When you dig into the production context, it stops being mystical and starts being normal. Kishimoto has said in interviews that Toby's exact identity wasn't fully nailed down at his first appearance. At different planning stages, Toby was going to be Madara for real, or a nobody using Madara's name, or a kind of composite stand-in for the Uchiha clan's grudge. Obito as the final answer crystallized later, when Kishimoto realized he could fold Kakashi's backstory, Rin's death, and the Eye of the Moon plan into one emotional payload. That doesn't mean he rolled dice the night before the chapter and prayed. It means the author kept Toby deliberately ambiguous, so he had room to maneuver. Mask, one eye, vague trauma. That's not a 300 chapter master plan. That's a flexible character slot. Once Obito was chosen, suddenly every earlier ambiguity could be about Obito. The swirl on the mask, goggles, the fixation on Kakashi, the vague lines about the past, retroactively specific. This is what I'm calling retrofitting. You take an existing piece, Toby, the goofy masked henchman, and you weave him into a deeper narrative later. You assign intentional meaning to details that were originally just convenient or open-ended. The result feels seamless. Fans swear it was planned from day one, but the order of operations is reversed. The story decided the hint, not the hint deciding the story. And listen to me, this is not a sin. This is fine. This is normal. This is how serial storytelling survives deadlines and popularity polls and editors breathing down your neck. The problem only shows up when the community shoves retrofits and real foreshadowing into the same category and calls all of it proof of a 20-year omniscient brain. Because once you can see the retrofit Naruto, you can start asking uncomfortable questions elsewhere. When we talk about Joy Boy's failure, about the Poneglyph apology, about who actually sabotaged that plan, are we looking at pure pre-written design or a very elegant retrofit that's hiding something much uglier? Hold that in your head, because the next part is where the betrayal starts to come into focus. So when we say, are we looking at pure pre-written design or an elegant retrofit, there's a hidden assumption in there I need you to notice. We instinctively think, well, if it hit me that hard, it must have been meticulously planned from day one. Big twist. Big brain author. Small twist, probably improv. Our pattern-seeking monkey brain that sees Jesus in toast cannot accept the idea that something emotionally devastating was also, structurally, a patch. Here's the thing. Emotional payoff and technical category are not the same axis. They feel connected, so your brain welds them together. This made me cry. Therefore, it was intentional foreshadowing. That's the equation. But that's not craft. That's vibes. The real question isn't, was this pre-written? It's, does this respect what we already know about the characters, the world building, the themes? If the answer is yes, then even a retrofit can feel inevitable. Take Toby. When the mask comes off and it's Obito, the punch in the gut is not because Kishimoto had a 500-page Obito Bible written in middle school. The punch is because we already sat with Kakashi's guilt, Rin's death, the graveyard of failed promises in that story. The emotional weight comes from bonds and regret that were built honestly over time. The reveal is plugging a new wire into an existing circuit. The electricity was already there. Structurally, Toby went through multiple identities in planning. Emotionally, it lands anyway, because it's coherent with the story Naruto had become. Now apply that lens to Joy Boy. The Fishman Island Poneglyph gives us an apology, a broken promise involving Noah and the mermaid princess of that era. For years, fans treated Joy Boy failed as this clean, pre-written tragedy. But the impact of that idea does not prove Oda had every betrayal detail locked in 25 years ago. What it proves is that oppression of Fishman Island, the theme of inherited hatred, and the dream of reaching the surface have been baked into the dough from Arlong onward. So when you reframe Joy Boy's failure as sabotage, as systemic betrayal by the same forces that erased the Void Century, it still clicks. Because the world has always been rigged against people who try to keep that kind of promise. Listen to me. This is not a sin. This is normal. This is fine. An author can start with, there was a great promise that went wrong, and as the story deepens, sharpen that into, it went wrong because the world government, the ancient weapons, and the D-Clan were all part of a conspiracy he couldn't beat. As long as that sharpening honours prior characterization and the existing Poneglyph trail, the emotional truth stays intact. And in Joy Boy's case, the evidence actually points to a blend. Early pre-writing about a broken promise and an inherited will refined over years into a narrative of sabotage that mirrors Luffy's journey, his Nika fruit, and a world that keeps trying to repeat the same crime. Which raises a harder question. If the payoff can be that strong even with retrofitting involved, what else in One Piece have we been mislabeling as perfect foreshadowing when it's really a carefully hidden pivot? Hold that. Because now we need to look at the receipts. Which brings us to the receipts that almost nobody in the community files under the right category. Because listen to me, Joy Boy does not enter this story as a character. He enters as a whole, a sorry, an absence. When we first meet Joy Boy on Fishman Island, we don't see him save anyone, crack jokes, or swing a sword. We see an apology carved into indestructible stone. The Poneglyph doesn't say, "Here's what I did." It says, "My bad. I couldn't keep the promise tied to Noah and the Mermaid Princess." That's not a flashback. That's a crime scene outline. The author is literally introducing you to a missing body. And here's the thing. That is pure pre-writing territory. This is not a dude Oda has been actively writing on the page for 25 years, slowly revealing his character arc. This is a planned void, a name anchored to a promise, a weapon-sized arc, and the future of an entire race, with the actual mechanics deliberately withheld. No description of the plan, no step-by-step of how he failed. Just, there was a promise, there was Noah, there was Poseidon, and somehow it didn't happen. When an author does that, they're not foreshadowing in the classic gun on the mantelpiece sense. They're pinning a red string node on the conspiracy board before you even see the rest of the web. Pre-writing means the decision about Joy Boy's role in the Void Century exists off-screen in Oda's notes, long before we ever read that apology. The setup on Fishman Island is a fragment of a decision that's already been made. We're just seeing the negative space. And that negative space gives Oda absurd flexibility while still feeling intentional. He can later reveal that Joy Boy was naive and outplayed, or that he was absurdly overpowered and physically stopped, or that he was betrayed at the final hour by the very allies meant to help him move Fishman Island to the surface. Any of those can be slotted in, and the apology still tracks. The promise still tracks. Noah still tracks. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is normal pre-writing scaffolding. But I need you to notice what that scaffolding is optimized for. When you start a character as an apologetic ghost, the darkest possible explanation will always hit the hardest. He messed up is mildly tragic. He was sabotaged while trying to free an oppressed race is nuclear. The betrayal reading becomes powerful precisely because Joy Boy is introduced as a pre-written void. Oda can pour pure horror into that empty container, and it will feel planned, not improvised. And once we start lining up Fishman Island's apology, Skypiea's sun god worship, Wano's execution of an ally of Joy Boy, and a world government that erases entire islands to hide history, the betrayal theory doesn't just sound edgy. It starts fitting the existing pre-written frame better than the simple "he failed his promise" narrative. Hold that thought, because now we need to run that interpretation through the actual islands one by one and see which story survives. So, if the betrayal theory actually fits the frame better, we need to go to the one place where Joy Boy admits he messed up and ask whether that admission even says what we think it says. I need you to mentally walk back to Fishman Island with me and sit in that room with Robin and the Poneglyph. Robin reads it. Ancient script, calm voice, everyone around her holding their breath. And the content is surprisingly simple. Joy Boy apologizing to the mermaid princess of that era for not keeping a promise involving Noah. No Void Century exposition dump. No manifesto. Just, sorry, I couldn't do it. The fandom took that and went, open and shut. Man fumbled the bag. Except, here's the thing. That stone never tells you why. It never tells you what stopped him, who interfered, or what the actual terms of the promise were beyond Noah plus Poseidon. We fill that gap in with our own headcanons, then forget we did that, then argue about it on forums as if Oda personally faxed us the details. This is not a sin. This is normal. Pattern-seeking monkey brain sees apology and auto-completes to personal failure. I need you to treat that poneglyph as if we're in court. Evidence, not gospel. Who wrote it down? Under what circumstances? Was Joy Boy personally carving that thing into indestructible stone mid-crisis? Or was someone else recording his words after the fact? And, crucially, who benefits if history remembers this entire debacle as Joy Boy's broken promise instead of somebody sabotaged the plan? Because once you frame it that way, the confession stops being the end of the conversation and becomes the start of cross-examination. An apology can be sincere and still strategically incomplete. "I'm sorry I couldn't keep our promise" tells you that Joy Boy feels responsible. It does not tell you whether he was prevented, betrayed, cornered, or literally nuked by a sky laser weapon we now suspect might be Uranus. And in a world where Imu erases islands off the map to hide inconvenient truths, you really want to assume the one piece of text that survived is a clean, unedited version of events. Come on. The world government has had 800 years to curate which fragments of the ancient kingdom's voice remain. The fact that this "I failed" message is allowed to exist at all should make you suspicious. Here's the category shift we need to make. Stop reading the Fishman Island Poneglyph as Joy Boy's diary entry and start reading it as a deposition transcript, potentially filtered through the people who carved it. Those carvers are not neutral stenographers. They are the same outlaw scholars and allies whose descendants are now scattered across O'Hara, Wano, Alabasta, Zoo, the exact network that got hunted down. So what happens if some of those allies were the ones who couldn't or didn't uphold their side of the bargain? What if the apology is Joy Boy eating the blame for a plan other people dropped? Hold that in your head, because when we start lining up the other poneglyphs, the pattern of who's recording what and who's suspiciously quiet gets a lot uglier. And nowhere is that ugliness clearer than Fishman Island, because the promise everyone boils down to, Joy Boy fumbled the bag, is structurally one of the most over-engineered multi-party projects in the entire story. This is not one guy saying, "I'll swing by on Tuesday," and ghosting. This is a generational migration plan with moving parts, backup systems, and literal god-tier logistics. So we need to actually break the promise down. On one side you have Noah, a colossal ark sitting under Fishman Island, explicitly described as a ship meant to be guided by a specific king, not anyone with a steering wheel license, a chosen monarch coordinating with forces that don't normally listen to humans at all. On the other side you have Poseidon, the mermaid princess whose power is to command sea kings, the only things big enough to move Noah safely through the ocean. And then you have the end goal, the entire population of fishmen and merfolk migrating to the surface into a world that historically enslaved them. Here's the thing, that's at least 4 categories of stakeholders before Joy Boy even enters the chat. You need Joy Boy, who clearly had the vision and the alliance network. You need Poseidon, who has to be born in that era, awakened and willing to cooperate. You need the people who built Noah in the first place, following blueprints that did not come from a weekend brainstorming session. And you need someone on the surface preparing a destination that isn't a death trap. Now ask yourself, does that sound like a solo failure scenario to you? Or does that sound intentional on the author's part, a planned structure that screams coalition? The Ark is not self-driving. The Sea Kings are not Uber. The surface world is not a neutral backdrop. Every step requires buy-in. Pattern interrupt. Imagine blaming the Titanic disaster solely on Guy who said the ship was unsinkable and ignoring the iceberg, the missing binoculars and the speed orders. That's what Joy Boy failed sounds like once you stare at Noah and Poseidon for more than 5 seconds. I need you to notice how fragile this chain is. If Poseidon never awakens, plan dies. If the builders of Noah are wiped out or conquered before handoff, plan dies. If the king who should guide Noah is replaced by a puppet regime with no intention of honouring the promise, plan dies. If the surface allies flinch at the last second because the world government leans on them, plan dies. And yet the community keeps repeating Joy Boy failed, as if that's a neutral description and not an accusation with a very specific narrative function. Blaming him neatly erases every other potential weak link. It conveniently moves the spotlight off whoever controlled the surface, whoever had the power to welcome fishmen, and instead didn't. Listen to me. In writing terms, this is not foreshadowing for one man's tragic incompetence. This is foreshadowing for sabotage. The author built a Rube Goldberg machine where any missing piece exposes intent. Calling it Joy Boy's failure is a PR move, not a summary. So when you zoom out, the Fishman Island promise doesn't read as one hero dropping the ball. It reads as a coordinated project that someone had a vested interest in stopping. The question isn't, why did Joy Boy mess up? The question is, who benefited from making sure he took the fall? Hold that, because when we start talking about who controls the surface and who commands the sky, the suspect list gets very small, very fast. Which brings us to the rock in the room. Who actually carved the sentence that makes Joy Boy sound incompetent in the first place? Because remember that I'm sorry I couldn't keep my promise isn't graffiti on some Fishman Island bathroom stall. It's on a poneglyph. And the people of O'Hara are very explicit about what that means. These things are not random stone tweets. They are engineered records from the Void Century, carved by an advanced civilization that was allied with the ancient kingdom and deliberately built to outlive a global censorship campaign. So, already, we're in a very specific category of storytelling. This isn't Joy Boy journaling. This is someone deciding what goes into the permanent, indestructible archive. And I need you to sit with that. If Joy Boy's apology is on a poneglyph, who put it there? Did Joy Boy personally dictate the text before the war? Did his closest allies record it afterward as a memorial? Or are we reading a curated version assembled by survivors who had their own agenda and a very real fear of being erased? Here's the thing. In this community, we talk about poneglyphs as if they are pure objective history. The true history, capital T, capital H. But even true history has an author. Someone chose the wording. Someone chose what to omit. Someone decided that in the middle of a continent-sized conspiracy, the line they were going to immortalize was, "Sorry I failed," and not, for example, "Sorry I was sabotaged by X, Y, and Z." This is not a sin. This is not bad writing from the in-universe historians. This is normal. Every record is both history and propaganda. The poneglyphs are obviously meant to preserve truth against the world government's editing, but they still reflect the perspective, the priorities, and the risk calculations of the carvers. You don't etch a full war crimes documentary into stone when the people who committed those crimes still control Uranus. So when fans read that Fishman Island poneglyph and go, "Wow, Joy Boy fumbled," I need you to hear how absurd that is. We're taking a single engraved apology, stripped of all proper nouns, and treating it as the whole story. There is no mention of who opposed him, no mention of the ancient weapons beyond vague implication, no mention of the specific mermaid princess, or the timing of the promise. That's not an accident. That's editing. And once you frame it that way, a much more intentional reading appears. The apology might be there to showcase Joy Boy's integrity, his willingness to own the outcome, while quietly omitting any context that would endanger the people carving the stone. Names of traitors? Omitted. Mechanism of betrayal? Omitted. Anything that would let the world government connect this slab to a living bloodline? Deleted for safety. Listen to me, when we start lining this up with other poneglyph sites, a pattern emerges. In Skypiea, an entire Sky Island civilization is gone, leaving behind a stone about Poseidon and a D on a bell. In Wano, A closed nation bleeds for centuries to guard road poneglyphs they barely understand. Over and over, allies die to protect a story that, if told in full, might be way darker than our hero failed his quest. And in the next part, when we follow that pattern upward to the sky, to the surface, and to the throne that supposedly doesn't exist, the question of who was doing the betraying gets a lot less abstract. So when we follow that pattern upward, we literally go up. To Sky PA, to a golden city that's already dead when we arrive. And listen to me, Shandora is not a quirky side quest. It's our first corpse on the road to Joy Boy. Recap what Oda quietly hands you there. Shandora was a thriving, proud civilization on Jaya. Bell Tower, advanced culture, warriors who would rather die than hand over a stone they barely understood. They guarded that poneglyph for centuries. Then a great war hits, the island is shattered, and a chunk of it is blasted into the sky by the knock-up stream. The city of gold becomes a graveyard in the clouds. That's not random storm damage. That's a crime scene, with the body moved. Here's the thing. The stone they died for is not just any poneglyph. It's a road-adjacent node in the exact same network as Joy Boy's apology. It talks about Poseidon, one of the ancient weapons, and points the reader forward deeper into the Void Century conspiracy. You read Sky PA, then Fishman Island, and you realise these aren't standalone lore dumps. They're pieces of a pre-written route, intentionally scattered, that all converge on Joy Boy's era. So we need to stop treating Shandora's fall as tragic backstory wallpaper. The combination of great war, destruction of an allied city, and the survival of only the stone is the pattern. The author is telling you, when someone tried to erase the ancient kingdom, they didn't just go for the capital, they went for the satellites. The people willing to host these stones were systematically wiped out, and the poneglyphs themselves were punted to the most inconvenient places possible. Bottom of the sea, Sky Islands, deep in Wano. That's not just hiding history. That's a coordinated cleanup operation. Now plug Joy Boy into that. His promise to Fishman Island clearly depended on infrastructure, Noah, Poseidon, and a network of civilizations that could cooperate on a global scale. If those civilizations are being annihilated one by one, is that Joy Boy failed? Or is that Joy Boy's entire support structure was hunted down while he was in the middle of the plan? This is not a sin in terms of storytelling. This is Oda using world building as evidence. And I need you to notice how early this clue shows up. Sky Pier is pre-Eni's lobby. Most fans were just pattern-seeking monkeys going, wow, gold bells, Enel is a meme, and this is fine. This is normal. But the author had already planted a dead ally of the ancient kingdom in the sky. Already shown you what happens to people who stand too close to that truth. Because if Shandora is one erased ally, what happens when we zoom out and count all of them? When you zoom out, Shandora is just one erased ally on the map. But there's another ally that didn't get erased. It went underground. It slammed the door shut and said, we'll wait. That's Wano. So we need to talk about Wano's borders, because this is where the Joy Boy just failed lol narrative in the community starts to fall apart. In Odin's flashback, Wano is not some eternal hermit kingdom. It was open. It traded. It connected. It was part of that ancient kingdom network the world government keeps trying to delete. Then something happens in the Void Century, and the country does a complete 180. It literally walls itself off from the world, not as a cultural quirk, but as a survival strategy. Odin reads Roger's notes, reads the poneglyphs, and suddenly this goofy dude who boils himself for his people is talking like a project manager for a 900-year delayed launch. He says Wano once opened, then deliberately closed its borders to wait for Joy Boy, not to mourn Joy Boy, not because Joy Boy was a loser, to wait. That's a future-facing verb. That's a scheduled continuation. Here's the thing. Odin explicitly ties Wano's reopening to Joy Boy's return. He doesn't say one day Wano will open because it's morally correct. He says, in effect, we are a lock. Joy Boy is the key, and I need you to hold this door shut until the right person shows up. That is not the language of a completed story. That is the language of a plan that was interrupted mid-execution and then put on ice. And this is where the Joy Boy just couldn't hack it interpretation starts to look silly. If Joy Boy simply failed due to personal weakness, incompetence, or bad RNG, why would anyone design a centuries-long contingency that depends on his successor? You don't build a multi-generational relay race around the guy who dropped the baton. You build it around a mission that got ambushed on the track. Wano's forced isolation reads as a defensive reaction to a catastrophic betrayal or defeat in the Void Century. The borders are a bunker. The Kazuki clan engraving Poneglyphs, hiding Pluton, and encoding instructions for the one who will guide the world to dawn is not grief. It's crisis management. It's the author showing you an ally nation that saw the first attempt fail, then decided to preserve one piece of the plan in pristine condition for a future run. Pattern interrupt. If Joy Boy's story was simply tragic failure, the most realistic reaction isn't a secret plan. It's despair, assimilation, or extinction. Fishman Island gets pushed underground, Shandora is blasted out of the sky, Lulusia gets erased. That's the world government's pattern. Crush, erase, move on. Wano breaks that pattern by choosing stasis over surrender. So when Odin says Wano must open for Joy Boy, that's not foreshadowing of a random prophecy. That's pre-writing of a deferred mission. The original Joy Boy was sabotaged. The world government tried to crush the network. Wano's allies hit pause. They froze the board, hid a weapon, stored the records, and waited for the author's already planned second attempt. Which means when Luffy shows up in Wano and the borders debate reignites, you're not watching a new story, you're watching a centuries-old save file finally resume from the last checkpoint. Because once you realize we're loading an old save file, you have to ask, who deleted the original run? Who was so terrified of Joy Boy that they nuked the entire server? So, quick recap we need to hold in our heads. The Ancient Kingdom wasn't some random island nation with good vibes and a cool flag. It was a powerful, absurdly advanced civilization that stood in open opposition to the 20 kings who would become the world government. These are the people whose tech still makes Vegapunk fanboy centuries later. These are the people whose very name had to be erased so thoroughly that the history itself became a crime. Now, here's the thing. Joy Boy's story is preserved in the exact same hard drive the Ancient Kingdom used, the Poneglyph network. His apology to Fishman Island, his broken promise tied to Noah and the original Poseidon, it's carved in that indestructible script only a handful of scholars can read. That's not an accident. That's not a cute side quest. That is the author pointing a giant neon arrow that says, this guy was part of the same faction the world government tried to delete. Listen to me. You don't get your diary entries stored in the same vault as state secrets unless you were core to the conflict. The people who recorded the Ancient Kingdom's final message also recorded Joy Boy's failure. Same medium, same encryption, same death sentence if you try to decode it. That's intentional storytelling. That's categorizing Joy Boy as a key piece of the lost enemy state, not some solo clown who whiffed a promise. And then you stack the D-clan on top of that. The enemies of the gods. The people whose very initial makes celestial dragons twitch. Every time a D smiles in the face of death, the story is screaming, this is inherited will, not coincidence. Their lineage runs straight through that erased kingdom's resistance. Luffy, Roger, Law, Garp, Dragon, different methods, same gravitational pull toward tearing down the existing order. So if Joy Boy was a D, aligned with the Ancient Kingdom, wielding or coordinating around ancient weapons, and inspiring a bloodline that still haunts the ruling class, I need you to see how that paints a target on his back the size of Red Line. In a war this scale, your top agent is not just someone you kill. They're someone you sabotage, infiltrate, and betray from the inside. Because the worst case scenario isn't their death. It's their success. And in that context, calling what happened to Joy Boy a simple failure feels insane. In a world where Emu can erase Lucia off the map, where history itself is contraband, where a single fruit gets hunted for centuries, does it really make sense that Joy Boy just fumbled? Or is it way more reasonable that somebody, somewhere, made absolutely sure he couldn't win? Hold that suspicion, because next we need to talk about who had both motive and access. So when I say motive and access, I'm obviously pointing at the people who can delete an island the way you or I delete a bad tweet. Imu and the Gorosei are not symbolic figureheads. They are the shadow rulers who decide that Lulusia simply does not get to exist anymore because some poor citizens happen to be standing on the wrong patch of foreshadowing. Here's the thing. Censorship is one category of control. You ban a book, you jail a scholar, you spin the story. Annoying, authoritarian, but still operating inside the realm of we're embarrassed about our past. What Imu and the Gorosei are doing is a different category entirely. They don't just suppress information, they vaporize the hard drive, the backup, and everyone who ever read the file. We need to walk through the pattern. O'Hara discovers the Void Century, Buster Call, complete eradication of the island, Tree of Knowledge on fire, scholars hunted down to the last survivor. Lucia accidentally becomes a staging ground for Sabo and a few too curious citizens. Imu personally targets it with what is almost certainly Uranus, turning an entire nation into negative space on a map. Entire bloodlines, from O'Hara's archaeologists to the D-Clan, are treated as contraband hardware that needs to be smashed before it boots up. Ask yourself, why? If the story was simply, Joy Boy made a promise and failed to keep it, that is tragic, sure, but it's not structurally destabilizing. Our legendary hero messed up is an embarrassing myth revision, not an active crime scene. You don't need to nuke libraries for that. You write a new textbook, you do some PR, you make a sad statue and move on. So I need you to sit with the scale of the reaction here. The world government behaves the way you behave when there's still blood on the floor and fingerprints on the doorknob, not when your great-great-grandpa was mildly cringe. This is not a sin of overzealous historians. This is an ongoing cover-up, which is where the betrayal theory stops being fan fiction and starts being the only explanation that fits their own behavior. If Joy Boy was working with or around the original 20 kings and they sabotaged his plan, weaponized the ancient weapons for themselves, and then framed him as the villain who threatened the world, suddenly the Annihilation Protocol makes sense. You're not hiding his incompetence, you're hiding your coup. And listen to me, the way they treat Poseidon, Pluton, Uranus, and now the Nika fruit is the smoking gun. These aren't random natural disasters they're afraid of. These are tools of a stolen victory, loose evidence that the winning side cheated. From that angle, every Poneglyph stops being a fun lore collectible and starts reading like a witness statement the government has been trying to burn for 800 years. The apology at Fishman Island, the Rio Poneglyph on Laugh Tale, the scattered roadstones, they form a trail that directly contradicts the official story. Fans in the community keep treating this as mysterious backstory, but the author is writing it as a legal case. And here's where it gets worse. When you line up Imu's behavior with that Poneglyph trail, it doesn't look anything like protecting the legacy of a failed ally. It looks exactly like burying evidence of a rigged, genocidal victory that's still legally actionable in the present, which means Joy Boy's failure might not be over, it might be pending. Because if this is a crime scene, then somebody has to reopen it, and the person they're most afraid of is carrying the same will, the same fruit, and the same target on his back. So next, we need to talk about what happens when the original victim walks back into the courtroom through his successor. So if Joy Boy is walking back into the courtroom through Luffy, we need to talk about the murder weapons. Because the Void Century isn't just a political coup, it's an arms heist. Quick recap so we're on the same page. We have 3 ancient weapons: Poseidon, a living mermaid princess who can command sea kings, confirmed on panel as Shirahoshi's inherited role. Pluton, a legendary battleship blueprint so dangerous that Tom's apprentices were willing to burn it rather than let the world government get a photocopy. Uranus, the mystery box hinted to be some kind of sky or orbital weapon, maybe what erased Lulusha in a single panel of Nope. 3 different categories of power, all explicitly world-shaking. None of that is subtle. Now here's the thing. Joy Boy's promise is directly wired into that system. The Fishman Island Poneglyph doesn't just say "my bad." It ties his apology to Noah and to the mermaid princess of that era, i.e. the previous Poseidon. That's not a random coincidence. That's intentional design. You do not build a continent-sized ark parked above a fragile kingdom, connect it to a living weapon that commands the ocean's apex predators, and then go, oops, scheduling conflict. This was a planned operation. A liberation event, a controlled, weapon-assisted migration to the surface, which is exactly why it's the perfect pivot point for betrayal. If you're the 20 kings looking at this ancient kingdom with living doomsday mermaids, city killer ships, and an unknown third trump card, what do? You don't just ban the word void. You either seize the weapons or you neutralize them. You turn Poseidon from a messiah of the sea into a hostage. You turn Pluton from a deterrent into your own nuke. Uranus, you keep that one in the back pocket for when erasing an island solves a political problem. Listen to me. This is not a sin in terms of storytelling. This is how you write a rigged board. Power itself isn't evil. The foreshadowing baked into One Piece is that the same tools can be salvation or catastrophe, depending on who holds the trigger. The Sea Kings moving Noah can be an exodus or an extinction event. Pluton can end an era of tyranny or start one. The difference is whose flag is on the mast. So where does the betrayal land? The cleanest version is ugly. Someone close to Joy Boy compromises access to an ancient weapon. Maybe the Poseidon of that age is coerced, forced to stand down, or used as leverage. Maybe Pluton's location or schematics get handed to the enemy under the banner of keeping the peace. Suddenly, Joy Boy's beautifully planned migration becomes a hostage situation. He can't fire the gun without hitting the people he's trying to save. He can't move Noah without triggering retaliation. So he aborts. He apologizes. Not because the plan was stupid, but because the board state was hacked in real time. And if your pattern-seeking monkey brain is already seeing Jesus in this toast, good, because this framing is perfectly consistent with the broader themes. Inherited will, stolen history, and power being morally neutral until someone weaponizes access. Which raises the next problem. If those weapons were the pivot then, what happens when their successors start waking up now? Which means we need to talk about the one mechanic that makes all of this even remotely coherent. Inherited will. Because if ancient weapons are waking up again, that only matters if someone's old plan is still in motion. And in One Piece, old plan still in motion has a name. It's Roger's laugh on Laugh Tale echoing into Luffy's grin. It's Odin boiling alive so Momonosuke can drag Wano 20 years into the future. It's Jaguar D, Saul dying in Ohara so Robin can walk out of the flames with the books. This is not subtle. This is the author grabbing you by the face and yelling, "Nothing important ends with one person." Inherited will is not a cute slogan. It's a structural rule of the story. Roger literally tells Rayleigh, "We were too early," and chooses to disband. Not because he failed, but because he knows someone else will come. Odin writes in his journal about the one who will carry Joy Boy's will. That is explicit language. That is not, wow, what a tragic loser from 800 years ago. That is, there is a relay race going on and we are not the final runners. Listen to me. You do not write a character this way if their story is supposed to be a closed, failed chapter. Joy Boy is introduced entirely through aftermath. An apology on a poneglyph, a promise involving Noah and Poseidon that still matters in the present. The world government panicking at the idea of his return. That is all persistence. That is all foreshadowing that his will did not die with his body. And the D clan as a whole is the category label on that persistence. Those who carry the name of D are the enemies of the gods. You have Saul, a D, risking everything so Robin can read the stones that record Joy Boy's words. You have Luffy, a D, accidentally eating the very fruit the government has been hiding for centuries, then being called Joy Boy by Zunesha. At some point, you stop being a pattern-seeking monkey seeing Jesus in toast and admit the author is doing this on purpose. Here's the thing. Roger and Odin do not talk about Joy Boy as a guy who blew it. They talk about timing, about waiting, about that day when the right person arrives. That only makes sense if Joy Boy's mission was interrupted by external force. If he was betrayed, ambushed, cut off from his weapons and his allies. If the board was flipped mid-game and the only counterplay was to push the will itself forward in time. That's what inherited will does in this story. It is the narrative mechanism for reviving an interrupted plan without retrofitting anything. The Void Century doesn't need a rewrite because the baton was always meant to cross generations. Luffy stepping into Joy Boy's role is not a cute reincarnation twist. It's the payoff of an intentionally delayed strategy finally reaching the right time. Which raises the real problem. If Joy Boy's will survived, where did the betrayal actually happen? And who is still benefiting from it now? So when we ask, who betrayed Joy Boy? I need you to remember something very simple. 4 guys already read the answer and then deliberately put the book back on the shelf. Roger, Odin, Rayleigh, the whole Oro Jackson crew reach Laugh-Tale, learn the Void Century, see Joy Boy's apology, and they burst out laughing. Not because genocide is a solid punchline, because the situation is so absurd, so structurally doomed, that the only sane reaction is to laugh so you don't scream. That's not ha-ha goofy rubber man. That's the laughter of people who just realised the entire game board has been glued to the table. Here's the thing. If Joy Boy's story was just, he was too weak, skill issue, get good, the response is obvious. You gear up, you sail back out, you correct the mistake. You don't walk away. You don't say, 20 years from now, someone else. The fact that the Pirate King himself hits the end of the world, sees the truth and then chooses to wait, that's your foreshadowing that the problem isn't individual failure. It's the rules of the world. Roger literally tells Rayleigh, we were too early. Not we're too scared. Not this is above our pay grade. Too early. That is timing, not courage. That is an author telegraphing that Joy Boy's so-called failure was bound to the calendar and the system, not his personal resolve. Roger's solution is to start the Great Pirate Era, scatter the keys, and trust that someone born into a different configuration of powers, weapons, and enemies will have a shot he never did. He doesn't fix the board, he kicks it over so future players swarm the table. And Odin. Odin comes back from Laugh-Tale, a man possessed. He doesn't say, I'm going to become Joy Boy 2.0. He says, we need to open Wano's borders for Joy Boy. That wording matters. His entire late-game writing is framed as infrastructure work. He's trying to unbolt one of the locks that pinned Joy Boy down. When Kaido and Orochi crush him, that's not just a tragic character death. It's the story literally telling you the conditions are still hostile. If Joy Boy just choked on the 1 yard line, Odin and Roger could have treated the Void Century as a redo mission. Run it back. Same quest, better stats. Instead, they recognize a structural prison. Ancient weapons dormant. Wano sealed. Fishman Island still under the heel of discrimination. The world government at peak censorship. This is not a sin in their courage. This is normal. When the system is rigged, so they wait. They gamble on a future era where the Nika fruit slips their net again, where Poseidon is reborn, where nations start to wobble. And listen to me. That means what they saw on Laugh-Tale wasn't just a sad story. It was evidence of a crime scene that's still active. Because if the board is rigged, someone is doing the rigging. And the real question is, who looked at Joy Boy, saw a threat, and designed an entire world where even the Pirate King had to say, not yet? And that who doesn't just rig history in the abstract. They're out here trying to rig biology. Because the cleanest way to make sure Joy Boy never finishes the job, you don't just burn the records. You try to delete the body he would need to come back. Enter Wano, and the single funniest HR mislabeling in all of Shonen. We spend 20 plus years thinking Luffy ate the Gomu Gomu no Mi, a goofy rubber fruit that turns him into a Looney Tunes crash test dummy. Then the Gorosei drop the bomb. No, actually, it's the Hito Hito no Mi, model Nika, a mythical Zoan tied to the sun god of liberation and joy, the fruit of a literal freedom deity whose fighting style is do whatever is most fun, and whose presence makes drums start playing in the sky. That's not a combat gimmick. That's a mission statement. The author didn't just hand Luffy a strong power. He handed him a role that already existed in the world, a role the government has been trying to strangle for centuries. Because here's the thing. The Gorosei don't talk about this fruit the way they talk about, say, Whitebeard's Gura Gura. They say it has evaded them for 800 years, as if a piece of produce has a VPN and a fake passport. They've been intentionally hunting this one fruit, classifying it under a fake name, and yet somehow it keeps slipping out of their fingers and into the worst possible hands for them. Roger's era, Shanks, and then the guy whose entire brand is, I will become Pirate King in broad daylight. I need you to sit with how insane that is from a logistics perspective. The world government controls the Marines, the cipher poles, the heavenly dragons, literal weather weapons. They can erase an entire country, Lucia style, in a single beam of narrative overkill. And still, this one mythical Zoan keeps getting lost in transit and ending up on the desk of Destiny's most chaotic intern. This is not a sin of bad security. This is not a normal devil fruit. This is an ongoing, active containment breach. The pattern is the point. You don't chase one specific power for 8 centuries unless you're terrified of a very specific outcome. Another Joy Boy with the exact toolkit needed to unrig the board you built. Which loops us back to betrayal. If Joy Boy's original plan was sabotaged, if someone on the inside flipped the table at the last second, then the Nika fruit is the unfinished weapon they failed to destroy. The traitor's nightmare isn't the story getting out. It's the story getting a sequel starring a protagonist with the same will and a body that can actually finish the script. So when the Gorosei whisper about Nika, when Emu greenlights island deletion, that's not embarrassment over old history. That's fear of a crime being overturned in appellate court. And the fruit itself becomes the smoking gun, the one piece of evidence they can't quite burn, which raises a brutal question. If the power keeps coming back, what else did they fail to erase? So when the fruit keeps respawning on the character select screen, you have to ask, who's it waiting for? And the story answers with a sledgehammer. Zunesha hearing the drums of liberation and going, Joy Boy has returned. Momonosuke, who has literal plot radio tuned to ancient Wano, recognizing that presence in Luffy. The Gorosei calling it the Nika fruit the second it awakens. The entire world reacting not to Gear 5 as a power-up, but to a title coming back on stage. That's not vibes. That's not the community being a pattern-seeking monkey that sees Jesus in toast. That is intentional, structural foreshadowing. The author is screaming at you, this is the same role. This is the same job. Different contractor. Listen to me. Calling Luffy the second coming of Joy Boy is not just a cool mythic reskin. It's a category decision in the writing. It says Joy Boy's story is not finished business. It's a suspended mission. You do not get a return of someone whose plotline was he made a promise, fumbled it, and died sad. You get a return when the design document is still open on the desktop and the deadline got pushed 800 years. Here's the thing. If Joy Boy was just the dude who ghosted Fishman Island, The reaction scale doesn't make sense. Why are the Gorosei terrified of a name on a drumbeat? Why are ancient prophecies, from Fishman Island to Wano, calibrated around when Joy Boy appears again, instead of remember that clown who failed us? This is not a sin in the fandom, by the way. This is normal. We hear apology, and our brain files it under personal failure instead of evidence in a legal case. But the fear only tracks if Joy Boy almost broke the game. If, during the Void Century, he and the Ancient Kingdom brought the world order to the brink, got stopped not by incompetence but by betrayal, and had enough time to scatter a blueprint across poneglyphs, ancient weapons, and inherited wills. Luffy awakening Nika is then not a random miracle. It's a planned contingency finally firing after 8 centuries of cooldown. I need you to notice how everyone behaves around Luffy's awakening. Zunesha doesn't say, a new god has appeared. It says, Joy Boy. The Gorosei don't say, oh no, a powerful rubber man. They explicitly connect the fruit's true name to the legend they've been trying to erase. Momonosuke doesn't fully understand it, but he feels the same presence that Oden and Roger chased. The story is collapsing 3 identities, Nika, Joy Boy, Luffy, into one job description. Which means Luffy's journey cannot just be become Pirate King and flex on some Marines. He's walking back into an 800-year-old crime scene, following the exact trail the first guy left, and rerunning a mission that was sabotaged at the final objective. And if that's true, then the next question is brutal. Who were the original accomplices, and who's about to repeat the betrayal? So when we ask, who betrayed Joy Boy, I need you to zoom out from the cosmic lore for a second, and remember where Oda started training you to see rigged games. East Blue. Before Void Century, before Ancient Weapons, we got Syrup Village and Arlong Park. On paper, small stakes. In practice, they're tutorial levels for systemic betrayal. Take Syrup Village. On the surface, it's just weird long-nosed guy, evil butler, murder plot. But look at the structure. Kuro fakes his own death, slips into a position of trust, and spends years manipulating a rich girl's life so he can legally inherit everything. The Marines, nowhere. The law, on his side. The problem isn't just one bad guy. It's a system that rewards the dude who can weaponize paperwork and patience. That's not a random pirate fight. That's the foreshadowing of a world where the real villains write the rules. Then Arlong Park hits and rips the training wheels off. Arlong doesn't just conquer Kokoyashi. He signs a contract with corrupt Marines, pays them off, and uses legal bounties and maps to keep Nami chained. Bellmare dies not because Arlong is strong, but because the state has put a price tag on existing as a poor woman with kids. Listen to me. That's not just tragedy. That's a tutorial in how oppression hides behind uniforms and stamps. The authority isn't broken by accident. It is intentionally weaponized. Here's the thing. By the time you reach Alabasta, Oda assumes you've passed the test. Crocodile is just Arlong with a corporate budget and a better PR team. He infiltrates a kingdom, forms Baroque works, and then destabilizes the nation using misinformation and weaponized scarcity. Dance powder, staged rebel attacks, fake heroes, doctored narratives. He doesn't conquer Alabasta by force. He makes the people beg him to save them from a crisis he engineered. The official story says, Cobra is the problem. The king failed. Sound familiar? This is where we need to stop pretending these are disconnected arcs. Syrup Village, Arlong Park, Alabasta, they're microcosms of the Void Century. A powerful entity rigs the game, rewrites the narrative, and frames the wrong people as villains or failures. Kuro frames pirates as the threat, while he's the real parasite in the mansion. Arlong frames humans as greedy monsters, while he's doing business with their government. Crocodile frames Cobra as an incompetent monarch while he's strangling the water supply off screen. That pattern is not a coincidence. It's planned. Oda's been quietly conditioning the community from Chapter 1. Do not trust the first explanation. Question the bounty poster. Question the hero. Question the apology carved into stone 800 years ago. When you finally hear that Joy Boy failed Fishman Island, you're supposed to flinch and go, okay, but who was holding the pen when that story got written? Because if early arcs teach you anything, it's this. The world of One Piece loves sabotaging liberators and then blaming them for the wreckage. And the really uncomfortable question is whether Joy Boy was the first, or just the first one who almost won. So we need to go somewhere everyone swears is a side story and treat it like a crime scene. Skypiea, the meme filler arc, the one the community keeps trying to skip on rereads. I need you to understand how insane that is, because if Joy Boy is the failed liberator, Skypiea is the rehearsal where Oda tests the entire liberation myth in miniature. Start with the obvious, the sun is everywhere. The Shandians painted on their bodies. They dance around bonfires. They beat those drums of liberation on their backs before charging into what is essentially a holy war. You have an oppressed sky people, land stolen, history erased, clinging to a god of the sun who promises freedom. How do we talk about that post-Gear 5 and pretend it's an accident? And then you have Noland and Calgera. On paper, it's a simple broken promise story. A foreigner says, I'll come back. Circumstances prevent him. Generations pass believing he betrayed them. Except here's the thing. That is literally Joy Boy's Fishman Island situation in prototype form. A promise made across species, a grand plan involving a sacred object, Noah, the Golden Bell, and history recording it as failure instead of sabotage. This is where I need you to separate categories again. Is Oda foreshadowing Nika in Skypiea? No. That would require him to have the exact Hito Hito no Mi model Nika mechanics fully locked in, the drumming heartbeat, the cartoon physics, the whole package. And we have zero evidence he did at that granularity. What he is doing is pre-writing. He is building a liberation myth template. Sky freedom, dancing drums, a sun god worshipped by dispossessed people, and a betrayed outsider whose intentions were pure. Then, decades later, he drops the name Nika and tells you the drums you heard in Skypiea were not just quirky world building. They were fragments of a decision already made about what Joy Boy actually is. Pattern interrupt. Go back and watch Luffy's dance around the bonfire in Skypiea. No context of Nika. No Gear 5. It still reads as this raw, almost religious moment where a stranger is embraced as a long-awaited savior because he brings laughter and freedom. Now rewatch it after chapter 1044. It suddenly scans as the world rehearsing how it will respond when Joy Boy finally comes back and the drums start for real. In hindsight, Skypiea reads retroactively as Joy Boy's dress rehearsal. A liberator whose signal, the bell, is delayed for centuries. A friendship story turned into a betrayal myth by bad timing and missing information. An entire culture organizing itself around a misunderstood absence. And this is not a sin. This is not Oda cheating. This is how high-level writing works when an author has a planned endgame. You seed the pattern first, then attach the proper nouns later, which is exactly why the betrayal reading gets stronger, not weaker, the more you revisit Skypiea. The series has been training you from that arc onward to recognize a specific pattern. A would-be savior shows up, oppressive systems twist the narrative, and history calls it failure. Joy Boy is not the exception to that pattern. He is the apex. And once you see Skypiea as a rehearsal, you have to ask a much uglier question. If the myth keeps repeating, who keeps pulling the plug right before the promise is fulfilled? So when you ask who keeps pulling the plug, the story immediately hands you 2 case studies where the plug isn't just pulled. The whole outlet is carpet bombed. O'Hara first. Eni's lobby second. 2 arcs that the community treats as emotional backstory when they're actually the author holding up a neon sign that says, "This is what happened to Joy Boy's era." Here's the thing. O'Hara is not a tragic side quest. It is a controlled demolition of curiosity. You have a bunch of scholars doing the most normal, boring, beautiful thing in the world: research. They're reading rocks. They're cross-referencing inscriptions. They're basically history nerds with better biceps. And the moment the world government realizes they're touching the void century, the category flips. Scholars become criminals. Books become contraband. An island of librarians gets a Buster call. That escalation is insane on purpose. You don't send an entire fleet to vaporize a tree because you're mildly worried about plagiarism. You do that because the information they're approaching is structurally incompatible with your version of reality, and the fact that they hunt down even a single child survivor. Nico Robin, 8 years old, bounty on her head for existing, tells you the problem isn't weapons. The problem is witnesses. Now zoom to Eni's lobby, the so-called judicial island. This place is cosplay justice. It's a theme park where the rides are public executions. You walk through giant doors, you get processed through a court that has a 0% acquittal rate, and then you disappear into the gates of justice. It's not a legal system. It's a content farm for state-sanctioned erasure. The point isn't to decide truth. The point is to perform justice, so the fans in-universe never question the script. And who's at the center of that spectacle? Robin again. The one person who can read poneglyphs. The one person trained in the exact forbidden literacy that got O'Hara nuked. Listen to me. That is not a coincidence. That is intentional structural foreshadowing. O'Hara is the rehearsal Buster call. Eni's lobby is the televised version. Same crime, updated format. We need to stop treating these arcs as disconnected tragedies. They are modern reenactments of the original crime of the Void Century. Identify the people who know too much about Joy Boy, the ancient kingdom, the betrayal that ended it, and burn them, their homes and their footnotes off the map. The Poneglyph carvers engraved a backup of history. So the world government spends 800 years speedrunning delete save file. This is not a sin in terms of writing. This is how you show, in the present tense, what you can't depict from the past. Robin surviving that process is not just sad girl lore. It is a direct existential threat to the official narrative. Her ability to read those stones puts her in the same category as the original carvers, the same knowledge class that had to be exterminated for the betrayal of Joy Boy to stick. And the intensity of the response, Buster calls, global bounties, judicial theme parks, tells you something crucial. If Joy Boy had simply failed, you don't need all of this. You don't need to hunt children and torch islands and build entire islands as propaganda stages. You only need that when the truth isn't our hero messed up, but our entire world order is built on a crime we cannot let anyone read aloud. Which raises the next question. If the cover-up is that extreme, what exactly did Joy Boy try to do that scared them this much? So to answer that, we need to go back down, way down, back to the bottom of the sea where this whole Joy Boy failed narrative is actually framed for us. Fishman Island. Remember what Madame Chiali predicts and what Neptune keeps repeating. One day, a king will appear who can guide Noah. That king will lead the fishmen and merfolk to the surface. On paper, that sounds simple. In practice, that is a multi-layered narrative landmine that Oda buried under 20,000 meters of water. Here's the thing. Noah is not a random giant boat. It is explicitly tied to Joy Boy's original promise and to Poseidon, the mermaid princess of that era. That same configuration reappears with Shirahoshi and Luffy. Joy Boy, mermaid princess, arc. Luffy, Shirahoshi, arc. This is not subtle foreshadowing. This is the author putting the same equation on the board twice and asking you why the first attempt didn't solve. The prophecy about a future king doesn't read as Joy Boy was the guy and he blew it. It reads as Joy Boy was step one and someone else will have to finish the job. Prophecy in One Piece is never a hard script. It's a job posting. Someone has to choose to walk into that role. Luffy isn't dragged into guiding Noah by cosmic handcuffs. He insists on helping Shirahoshi. He punches a celestial dragon. He declares war on the world government. He keeps opting in. I need you to notice the pattern here. From Madame Shiali's visions to Oden's "someone will open this country in 20 years, these predictions are self-fulfilling setups for inherited will. They are not fate says so. They are, we wrote this into the operating system so the next generation will feel compelled to run it. The community inside the story is doing foreshadowing to itself. And that's where the Joy Boy failed label starts to fall apart. The existence of a written apology on a poneglyph plus a long-range prophecy about a future king implies that Joy Boy's own contemporaries anticipated the possibility that the mission would not be completed on the first try. You don't carve an apology into indestructible stone and then also leave a to-be-continued clause unless you know the plan might be interrupted. Interrupted by what? Weather? Scheduling conflicts? No. You build contingency when you expect resistance. You design a backup king, a backup mermaid princess, a backup arc when you know someone is going to try to break the chain. This is not a sin in storytelling. This is how you write a rebellion under an empire that kills islands to hide footnotes. Listen to me. You do not construct an entire migration plan, tie it to an ancient weapon, and then add a prophecy clause if you think success is guaranteed. That is paranoia. That is war planning. That is, someone in this room is going to stab us energy. The betrayal is baked into the architecture. So when the prophecy eventually intersects with Luffy, that's not just a cool parallel. That is the narrative bridge from Joy Boy's sabotaged attempt to a second run at the same promise under new conditions. The gun was already on the mantelpiece. Luffy is just the first person reckless enough to pick it up in a world that's been redesigned to make sure he never reaches the trigger. And if the world itself was redesigned, then we have to ask, who rewrote the stage after Joy Boy fell, and what did they change? So when we ask who rewrote the stage, Wano is the giant neon sign screaming the answer. Because Wano isn't just some cool samurai detour, it's the literal hinge between Joy Boy's sabotaged attempt and the rematch. And Oden is the poor guy who read the script early and realized he was going to die before Act 3. Remember what he learns on Roger's ship. Wano must open its borders before the day Joy Boy arrives. Not it would be nice if. Not optional DLC. A hard condition. He comes home, dances in the street, gets boiled alive, all while knowing there is a ticking, intentional deadline baked into the world's design. His frustration in that pot is not just, I failed Wano. It's, I saw the ending, I know what Joy Boy needs, and I'm checking out too early. Here's the thing. Wano's isolation is doing two contradictory jobs at once. On the surface, it's a prison, closed borders, no ships, no information flow, a country frozen in time while the rest of the world industrializes and collapses into pirate chaos. But under the floorboards, it's a shield. It's preserving the Kozuki knowledge of the Poneglyphs. It's sitting on Pluton. It's hiding the blueprint for the final war in a place the world government can't casually bust a call without breaking the entire planet. That dual role is not a coincidence. It screams planned, not improvised. The author is essentially saying, we need this weapon, this history, this bloodline to survive, but we also need them benched until the meta is different. The right time language Oden uses is doing a lot of foreshadowing work here. If there is a right time, there was a wrong time. Joy Boy went in when the enemy was too strong, or worse, when his supposed allies were compromised enough to set him out mid-mission. Pattern interrupt. This is the part where the community usually shrugs and says, well, listen to me. Luffy is not RNG just blessed by the gacha gods. The world has been slowly patched for 20 plus in-universe years to make a second attempt actually viable. Look at the modern era conditions. The age of pirates Roger kicked off has scattered powerful, anti-world government freaks across the map. The Shichibukai system, one of the main tools for co-opting pirates, has been dismantled. The Reverie exposes fractures among the Celestial Dragon's own ranks, while Emu is panic-deleting islands like Lulusia off the map. This is not background noise. This is the board being destabilized on purpose, so that when Wano finally opens and Pluton re-enters the conversation, there's room to move. So Wano's story doesn't position Luffy as some randomly lucky Joy Boy role. It positions him as the successor arriving in the only era where Joy Boy's betrayal can actually be avenged and reversed. The borders open, the prison turns into a launch pad, and the wrong time that killed the first attempt becomes the cautionary tale steering the second. And if timing is that central, then the next question is brutal. Who spent 800 years making sure the timing never lined up again? And what happens when they finally lose control of the clock? So when you ask, who's been controlling the clock, you run into a really uncomfortable follow-up. Whose version of Joy Boy's story are we actually reading? Because on paper, the Fishman Island Poneglyph is simple. It's an apology. Joy Boy saying, "Sorry, I couldn't keep the promise," tied to Noah and the mermaid princess of that era. End of story. Tragic. Kind of noble. Very shucks, I failed. But listen to me. Read the wording again. There's no reason given. No mention of who blocked him. No description of the war, the opposition, the political nightmare that we know the Void Century actually was. It's an apology stripped of context. That absence is loud. In real-world writing, when someone says, "I'm sorry I couldn't make it," and leaves out the car crash, the hospital visit, the hurricane, that's not just brevity. That's curation. That's someone choosing not to say what actually went wrong. And for Joy Boy, the guy entangled with ancient weapons and a global conflict, that's suspicious. Here's the thing. We need to at least entertain the possibility that this is not a confession of incompetence. It's a shield. Joy Boy taking the hit in the text to protect other people. "I broke my promise" is very different from "I was betrayed by X kingdom while Y clan was slaughtered and Z weapon was seized." One sentence is personal failure. The other is a detailed indictment that paints a target on every surviving ally and descendant. And who carved that poneglyph? Not Joy Boy. The scholars of the ancient kingdom, or their allies, etched that message into indestructible stone. They knew how dangerous information was. The entire Void Century is a redacted document. So of course they might record the emotional truth of the moment, his apology, without spelling out the full political context. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing of history. This is in fact how terrified resistance movements archive things when the Empire is actively hunting them. I need you to picture the meeting where they decide what goes on that block of stone. They can engrave the names of traitors, the exact mechanics of the plan, the identity of surviving factions, or they can keep it simple, human and deniable. Joy Boy failed us. That hurts, but it doesn't expose anyone currently hiding under the world government's boot. And that fits the character we're reverse engineering. Joy Boy as liberator. Joy Boy as Nika, the man of laughter who frees slaves. That guy, of all people, is not throwing his comrades under the bus for the sake of historical accuracy. If anything, he'd rather the future remember him as the one who dropped the ball than hand Emu a hit list etched in eternal stone. So the apology stops being a full account and becomes a strategic half-truth, a deliberately incomplete record. And the fact that the world government is still annihilating islands over Poneglyph research tells you what they're afraid of. Not that Joy Boy was a loser, but that someone will line up this failure with the broader pattern and realize there was a crime here, not a mistake. Which raises the next problem. If the text is a cover story, where do we find the uncensored version? And who in the present is still invested in keeping that buried? So if the official story is a cover-up, we do the thing you always do in a cover-up. You stop arguing about what, and you ask who benefits. I need you to put on your trashy detective hat for a second. We're not in law nerd mode anymore. We're in crime scene mode. First, lay out the suspects. At minimum, the Void Century has three big factions. The ancient kingdom itself, this hyper-advanced civilization Joy Boy was tied to, the allied nations and cultures that stood with it, the people who carved poneglyphs and sheltered D-bearers, and then the coalition of 20 kings who decided very intentionally to nuke that whole arrangement and found the world government. That's your cast, that's your lineup. Now, Joy Boy's promise to Fishman Island isn't some random side quest. It's tied to Noah, to Poseidon, to getting an entire persecuted race up to the surface and into the sun. Equality, migration, a literal end to segregation. Here's the thing. If you're those 20 kings trying to build a clean, hierarchical system where some people are gods and everyone else is furniture, that promise isn't just inconvenient. It's structurally fatal. You cannot have a world where fishmen walk the surface as equals and also have Marioji, where celestial dragons keep slaves in collars. Those two pieces of storytelling do not coexist. So when fans hand-wave this as Joy Boy fumbled his mission, you're missing the obvious power problem. His success would have preemptively deleted the racial and class categories the world government is built on. So who gains from that promise being broken? Not the ancient kingdom. Their entire ideology seems to be about the dawn, shared history, sun imagery, all that Nika foreshadowing. Not the allied civilizations. They're the ones risking extinction to carve receipts into indestructible stone. The only people who get a net win from Fishman Island staying under the boot are the 20 kings and their descendants. But we need to entertain the uglier possibility. Internal betrayal. Someone in Joy Boy's camp deciding very rationally that the cost of full revolution was too high. Maybe a rival noble house from the ancient kingdom. Maybe a subset of allied rulers who saw where this was heading and quietly cut a deal. Spare our bloodline, we'll hand you the keys. This is not a sin in human history. This is normal. Every revolution has a faction that blinks. Whether that traitor sat in Joy Boy's inner circle or in some allied throne room, the outcome is the same. The clear beneficiaries are the ancestors of the current celestial dragons, the people who got to build a pristine, orderly world on the corpse of whatever Joy Boy tried to do, then stamp his name as the guy who failed. In any crime story, you follow the benefit trail. And when you follow it here, it runs straight through the winners of the Void Century, the exact people still erasing islands over poneglyphs, which raises a nastier question we need to dig into. If they gained this much from sabotaging Joy Boy once, what are they planning to do when his successor gets close to finishing the job? Here's where the benefit trail turns into a war map. Because the series has been quietly screaming at you for hundreds of chapters that all of this is heading toward one thing: a final, system-breaking conflict. Whitebeard doesn't cough up a random prophecy at Marineford when he says the day will come that someone challenges the world and the entire world will be caught up in the war to come. That's the author stepping on a megaphone. We've had that line sitting next to Madame Shirley's vision of Luffy destroying Fishman Island, next to Roger saying he was too early, next to Odin's 20 years from now the ones who can fight will rise. That's not vibes. That's coordinated, intentional endgame writing. Different characters, different eras, same foreshadowing category. A rematch with whatever went down in the Void Century. But here's the thing. If you read that war as who gets to sit on the empty throne, or who controls which islands, you are underselling Oda harder than the community undersells Pell's survivability. This is not just about territory. It's about evidence. It's about dragging the sealed case file from 800 years ago into open court and saying in front of the entire planet, run this trial again. Joy Boy's attempt was sabotaged. We went through the benefit trail already. So the real question of the final war is not, can Luffy punch hard enough to win? The question is, can Joy Boy's original verdict be overturned? Can the world see who actually betrayed whom when the ancient kingdom fell? When the poneglyphs were carved, when that apology was forced into stone. And notice how the board is being rebuilt. Luffy's accidental, I just make friends by feeding them, strategy has very quietly reassembled a Joy Boy-style coalition. Fishman Island, directly tied to Joy Boy's promise and Poseidon. Wano, the closed nation that guarded Pluton and the Poneglyph craftsmen. The Revolutionary Army, openly targeting the Celestial Dragon's authority. Alabaster's legacy, Dressrosa's liberated toys, the Mink tribe, the Grand Fleet. I need you to see this pattern. Every major ally is a witness, a victim, or a custodian of Void Century fallout. This is not a sin. This is not lazy coincidence. This is planned, structural storytelling. The first Joy Boy had a coalition that got compromised. The second Joy Boy is building one that's too distributed, too emotionally bonded to be quietly stabbed in the back the same way. Pattern interrupt. What if the ancient weapons aren't primarily about blowing things up? What if they're about forcing the world to watch? Poseidon commands the Sea Kings, who carry Noah, a literal broadcast arc. Pluton is a ship that can redraw maps. Uranus can erase islands from the record. These are tools for rewriting the terms of the trial. So when the final war hits, the stakes are layered. Will Luffy survive? Sure, but more importantly, will Joy Boy finally be vindicated? Will the curtain on Emu, the Gorosei, and the original conspirators actually get pulled back in front of the jury of the entire world? We need to stop reading the endgame as a normal shonen tournament arc. It's a retrial. Same case, new evidence, a different Joy Boy on the stand, and this time every nation, every sky island, every fishman watching from the gallery. And if you think an author who pre-wrote his ending isn't building toward that exact public verdict, I need you to sit with what he's been seeding since chapter 1. And here's where we need to talk about something way less sexy than giant robots or sun gods. Paperwork. Historical paperwork. Because whoever holds the pen that writes history doesn't just record events. They assign blame. When a regime wins, they don't just win the war. They win the narrative. Victors become heroes. Rebels become villains. And all the messy in-between gets filed under classified and dropped into a trench. This is not a sin. This is normal. Every empire does it. You turn your war crimes into necessary measures. You turn their resistance into terrorism. And suddenly the moral scoreboard looks very tidy. Now put that in One Piece terms. The world government doesn't just censor a few chapters. They rip out an entire volume. The Void Century is gone. The Ancient Kingdom, gone. The D-Clan's role, gone. And then they leave you one surviving footnote with the name Joy Boy on it, attached to an apology. You don't have to be a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast to see what that does. If any scholar, any fan in universe ever stumbles on that name, it's already framed. Joy Boy isn't the guy who challenged the system. He's the guy who failed. The author of the official textbook has turned him into a cautionary tale without ever explaining the test he was taking. Listen to me. That's not an accident. That is intentional narrative control. That is planned propaganda. If you erase the context of the promise to Fishman Island, erase the war around the ancient weapons, erase the political stakes of moving Noah and awakening Poseidon, then I'm sorry I couldn't keep my promise reads as incompetence instead of sabotage. Which is exactly why the Poneglyphs feel so weird. They're a counter-archive. They preserve just enough to imply, hey, the syllabus you've been given is fake, but not enough to hand you the full answer key. Joy Boy's apology, the Rio Poneglyph, the scattered mentions of Pluton and Poseidon, they're fragments of a story that clearly exonerates him, but only if someone with Robin's brain sits down and actually assembles the puzzle. And until that happens, the misassigned blame holds. Pirates are framed as chaos gremlins, Marines as order, O'Hara's scholars as dangerous extremists, ancient weapons as unthinkable evils. Every category is flipped. The people asking questions are the threat. The people burning libraries are the protectors. You see the problem. Joy Boy is just the prototype for this move. He's the original misframed figure, Call him the beta version of D is dangerous. So when I say reading Joy Boy as betrayed instead of failed is necessary, I'm not asking you to buy into some galaxy brain fan theory. I need you to recognize it as a correction. The story itself has already told us the authors of history are unreliable. Taking their word on Joy Boy at face value isn't critical analysis. It's bad reading, which raises the real question. If the verdict on Joy Boy is wrong, what other truths in this world are booby-trapped by the same pen? So here's where the fandom brainworms crawl in. Once the community decided Joy Boy failed, everything after that got sorted into two neat buckets. Supports Joy Boy failed and noise. That's confirmation bias in its Sunday best. You grab the apology poneglyph on Fishman Island. You grab Shirahoshi crying about a broken promise. You grab a meme that says Joy Boy fumbled the bag, and suddenly that's not a theory anymore. That's a verdict. Everything that doesn't fit, must be a gag, a coincidence, or Oda changing his mind. Confirmation bias is simple. You start with the answer you prefer, then you only collect the evidence that agrees with you. You do not test the hypothesis. You feed it. We all do this. I do this. This is not a sin. This is normal. But when you're dealing with an author who is aggressively intentional, who has been pre-writing endgame reveals for decades, that habit stops being harmless and starts flattening the story. And meme culture pours gasoline on it. Short clips, cropped panels, TikToks with Joy Boy L in impact font over Noah falling through the water. Those formats reward the cleanest, dumbest version of the idea. Joy Boy failed is a perfect soundbite. Joy Boy was operating inside a rigged geopolitical structure where the record of his actions is mediated through hostile censors and grief-stricken allies who might be hiding their own guilt, does not fit in 15 seconds. So the reductive take wins the algorithm, gets repeated, and after the 50th repost it feels canon. Here's the thing. Oda's entire career is him refusing neat categories of hero, villain, and responsibility. Crocodile is a war criminal and a former protector. Garp is a loving grandpa and a cog in a genocidal machine. Robin is a child victim and an accomplice to crime syndicates. The writing keeps saying, do not simplify this. And the community keeps going, anyway, Joy Boy failed, LOL. Pattern interrupt. If Joy Boy failed so badly, why is the world government still terrified of his return 800 years later? Failure is not usually what haunts empires. Successful threats do. I need you to notice how often our discourse treats in-universe propaganda as authorial voice. The people telling you Joy Boy failed are the same structural forces that erased the Void Century, that bombed Lulusia off the map, that literally censored the name of a devil fruit for centuries. When those guys say, trust us, this guy just dropped the ball. We need to hear alarm bells, not closure. This is where the foreshadowing, retrofit, or pre-writing framework matters. It slows you down. Instead of retweeting the meme, you ask, is this panel setting up a planned payoff? Is it Oda reusing an old detail in a new way? Or is it a fragment of a decision made before chapter 1, peeking through the cracks? That question forces you to engage with intent, with category, with the difference between what the world of the story says and what the author is actually doing. Listen to me. Catchy summaries are fun. This is fine. But if we don't interrogate them, we end up doing the world government's PR for free. And Joy Boy is only the first failure that falls apart once you stop reading memes and start reading text, which means the next step is ugly. We have to go back to the so-called failure itself and ask who benefited from it, who recorded it, and who might be lying through very expensively printed stone teeth. And this is where the community does something very funny. We go from the world government is lying on giant indestructible rocks to Oda is a flawless 4D chess god who planned every Joy Boy comma in 1997. Those two thoughts do not coexist. One of them has to blink. When you insist that every Joy Boy hint, every mermaid panel, Every sundoodle was intentionally perfectly planned from chapter 1. You're not praising Oda. You're turning him into an inhuman oracle, a prophecy machine. And then the second anything feels off, any detail shifts or gets reinterpreted, it feels not just messy, but sacrilegious. The problem isn't the inconsistency. The problem is the myth you built around the author. Here's the thing. The real achievement is harder than that myth. Writing a 25-plus year story where Joy Boy evolves from guy who wrote an apology to central axis of the world's biggest crime, while the emotional payoff still lands, while the themes of inherited will and betrayal still line up with Luffy in Gear 5. Nika fruit blazing? That is way more impressive than some static frozen master plan that never changes. I need you to understand the categories here. Foreshadowing is when Oda intentionally plants a seed for a payoff he already knows. Laboon and Brook, Sanji's North Blue and Vinsmoke, the Fishman Island apology tying into Poseidon. Crew writing is the bigger skeleton. Joy Boy, the Void Century, the Ancient Kingdom, the idea that someone got sabotaged, not stupid. Retrofitting is when he looks back at an old panel and says, "Oh, that can carry more weight," and retools it. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is normal. Fans treat retrofits as cheating. If Joy Boy's betrayal angle wasn't fully, exhaustively planned on day one, then it doesn't count as real foreshadowing. No, it's craft. It's an author using his own archive as raw material. When Skypiea's mantra becomes hacky, that's a retrofit that strengthens the spine. When early Nika-ish imagery gets sharpened into Luffy's true fruit, that's pre-writing plus retrofit working together, not a pattern-seeking monkey seeing Jesus in toast. And listen to me, recognizing that doesn't make the story less magical. It makes the magic understandable and, crucially, replicable. You can study how Oda keeps Joy Boy thematically consistent. Apology, broken promise, inherited will, while upgrading the scope from Fishman Island logistics to the entire world was rigged against this man. You can learn from the way he uses foreshadowing for anchors, pre-writing for polish. Once you drop the 4D chess cult and accept that Joy Boy's betrayal arc is something Oda grew into, not a fully rendered PDF in his desk drawer on day one, One Piece stops being a sacred text and becomes what it actually is, a living, evolving work of storytelling, which then raises a much scarier question. If Joy Boy's role expanded over time, what else is still expanding under our feet right now? So we need to actually answer the question the title has been screaming this whole time. Did Joy Boy fail or not? Not vibes, not headcanon, not my pattern-seeking monkey brain saw a sad panel and decided it was deep. On the evidence. Here's the thing. In the narrow, boring accountant sense, yes, Joy Boy promised something to Fishman Island in his lifetime, involving Noah, involving the mermaid princess, involving bringing them to the surface. The Poneglyph is crystal clear on one point. He didn't do it. There is an apology carved in indestructible space rock. That is not what success looks like. But if you stop there, you're doing drive-by literary criticism. You're treating an intercontinental war as a missed dentist appointment. Because that Fishman Island promise was never a one-man side quest. It was multi-party from day one. Joy Boy, the mermaid princess, Poseidon, the people who built Noah, the ancient kingdom, backing the whole operation, the D-Clan network spread across the world. That's infrastructure. That's a coalition. When a coalition collapses, you don't just point at one guy and go, L, look at what the story actually shows you. The ancient kingdom, wiped. The D-bearers, hunted, scattered, turned into a cursed middle initial. The people who could read and write the Poneglyphs, forced into hiding on a burning island the world government eventually nukes anyway. This isn't Joy Boy chickened out. This is every pillar holding up the plan got systematically hammered into dust by an enemy with better weapons, better intel, and total control of the post-game patch notes. And the censorship is the smoking gun. Imu erasing Lulusia, the Gorosei cutting out entire centuries, the world government hiding the Nika fruit under a fake name for hundreds of years. When an author spends this much narrative energy on showing you how extreme the cover-up is, they're not setting up a clown who fumbled a promise. They're setting up a threat so dangerous the victors had to rewrite the operating system of the world just to contain the memory. So yes, Joy Boy failed in the technical sense. The mission didn't complete on his watch, but that failure is framed as forced, not chosen. Overwhelming opposition, betrayal somewhere in that alliance web, ancient weapons and royal bloodlines taken off the board or turned against him. Calling him a failure without that context is like blaming the revolution leader for losing when the other side had nukes, spies in half his inner circle, and then wrote every history textbook afterward. Listen to me. The apology on Fishman Island is not a tombstone. It's a relay baton. It's regret and instruction baked into one sentence, handed to whoever can still read the script. That's why the inherited will structure exists. That's why Roger hears the same story, laughs, and chooses to wait for the one instead of trying to brute force a rerun. The narrative isn't closing a file, it's marking it mission interrupted, successor required. And if Joy Boy's failure is really an interrupted, sabotaged endgame, then you have to ask a much uglier question. Who, specifically, pulled the plug? And how close are they to doing it to Luffy again? So here's where we flip the board. If Joy Boy was sabotaged, then the world Luffy inherits isn't fresh snow. It's a crime scene that's already been dusted for prints, catalogued, and then buried. Poneglyphs scattered across the globe, ancient weapons tucked into myth and geology, prophecies whispered into bloodlines, and enemies so entrenched they literally sit on a red stone throne. Luffy isn't starting a game. He's walking into round 2 of a match Joy Boy already tried to overturn. Look at the architecture of this world. The Fishman Island Poneglyph doesn't just say "my bad" and roll credits. It ties Joy Boy's apology to Noah, to the Mermaid Princess, to a promised migration to the surface. That's not a random oopsie. That's evidence of a planned, system-level operation that got interrupted. And instead of disappearing, that evidence is carved into indestructible cubes and scattered in a trail only future problem children can follow. That's not failure. That's version control. Listen to me. The fact that you can even reconstruct the Void Century is Joy Boy's real win condition. The ancient kingdom gets erased. The D-clan gets hunted. But somehow there's a preserved history pipeline. O'Hara's books, Roger's notes, Wano's closed borders, Fishman Island's promise, Zoo's moving fortress. These aren't Easter eggs. They're redundancies. Backup drives. Every alliance he touched, Wano, Fishman Island, the Kazuki Stonecutters, gets turned into a long fuse ally for whoever picks up the torch. And then there's the myth of return. Joy Boy will come again, the one who will guide us to the surface. Prophecy is foreshadowing weaponized as infrastructure. When Odin and Roger reach Laugh Tale and Laugh, they're not just reading lore, they're reading a design document that assumes a successor. The author inside the story, Joy Boy, is pre-writing the endgame for a future protagonist. Here's the thing. The game is still rigged, but it's marginally less cursed now. The world government is overextended, juggling Shichibukai fallout, Yonko chaos, revolutionary uprisings, and literal island deletion with Uranus. New powers have risen outside their control. Blackbeard's chaos, Shanks's diplomacy, Dragon's network, the worst generation clogging every sea lane. And in the middle of that, the Nika fruit they spent centuries suppressing just wakes up again in the most annoying rubber idiot possible. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is the intentional payoff of a system Joy Boy set in motion. Pattern interrupt. What if Joy Boy's mistake wasn't losing, but going first? We need to see his legacy as a combined warning label and roadmap. The Poneglyphs show what he tried, where he pushed, and where the world government hit back hard enough to delete an entire century. They tell Luffy, don't centralize everything in one kingdom, don't trust the same institutions, don't leave the ancient weapons uncoordinated. Last time the board was loaded and they flipped it on him. This time the pieces are scattered, mobile, harder to nuke in one go. So no, Joy Boy isn't a tragic footnote who just whiffed his promise. He's the architect of the only scenario where a second Joy Boy is even statistically possible. Luffy isn't fixing a random past failure. He's executing a planned sequel that was written into the bones of the world. And that raises a more uncomfortable narrative question. If the roadmap is this detailed, who else has read it? And who's already planning for Joy Boy Round 2? So when you're in a comment thread and someone goes, Joy Boy just failed his mission, end of story, I need you to understand you are allowed to be annoying about this. Politely, strategically, but annoying. Here's the thing. Words are doing a lot of quiet propaganda in this fandom. When you say Joy Boy failed, you're smuggling in this idea that he was incompetent, that the author planned a simple tragic whiff and moved on. That's not what the text is foreshadowing. So start by swapping the verb. Don't say he failed. Say his plan was interrupted. Say his promise was sabotaged. Same historical event, totally different category of storytelling. If someone asks you what that means, you don't need a 40-tweet thread. You zoom out. You go, the Fishman Island promise was never just Joy Boy and a giant boat. It was Joy Boy, the ancient kingdom, the mermaid princess who was Poseidon, the people who carved the Poneglyphs, and the enemies who started the Void Century War. Multiple parties, multiple moving pieces. When a multi-party operation collapses, pinning it on one dead guy is not analysis, it's PR. Use Fishman Island as your concrete example. The Poneglyph isn't Joy Boy's diary where he admits he's bad at promises. It's an apology recorded by a civilization with a tech to engrave permanent history that then mysteriously vanishes. You don't carve the receipt for your own incompetence into an indestructible stone. You carve evidence when you expect someone to try and rewrite what happened. So, here's your debate summary pre-packaged. Joy Boy came dangerously close to changing the world. A coalition stopped him, erased the ancient kingdom, and buried the evidence under the Void Century blackout. Joy Boy, knowing he'd been cut off, left a distributed will, poneglyphs, inherited ideals, a fruit that keeps evading the people hunting it. Luffy isn't doing better than Joy Boy. He's picking up a baton from a runner who got tackled at the finish line. And when someone in the community rolls their eyes and says, that's a reach, this is not a sin, this is fine, this is normal pattern-seeking monkey behavior, so you anchor it in ongoing behavior. You point at O'Hara being vaporized for researching history. You point at Lulusia being deleted from the map for being in the wrong narrative place at the wrong time. You point at centuries of suppressing Nika imagery and pretending the Hito Hito no Mi model, Nika, is just some random rubber gag. The world government is still reacting to a threat profile that started with Joy Boy. That's not headcanon, that's a pattern. And then, crucially, you frame all this as more than winning a power scaling argument. You say, I'm not defending Joy Boy's K/D ratio. I'm talking about what Oda is actually writing about. Systemic oppression, inherited will, the long, boring, generational grind of liberation, where one attempt gets crushed so the next one has better data. When you talk about Joy Boy as betrayed rather than bungling, you're not just being galaxy brain. You're aligning your read with the themes the author has been intentionally setting up for decades. Because if Joy Boy's story is framed correctly, it forces you to ask a much uglier question. If someone could sabotage him once, who's quietly preparing to do it again, this time to Luffy, in real time, while we watch? So let's grab the actual Joy Boy puzzle pieces and put them on the table, because I need you to see how this framework works in practice, not in abstract diagram land. We've got the Fishman Island apology poneglyph. We've got Noah. We've got Poseidon. We've got Wano's closed borders. We've got the D-Clan, We've got Nika, we've got the Great War, and Dawn of the World prophecies. That's the core Joy Boy cluster the community keeps mashing into, one giant glowing ball of foreshadowing. Here's the thing, they're not all the same category, and the difference matters. Start with the strongest foreshadowing, Void Century, Poneglyphs, Ancient Weapons, and the Will of D. These are in the story absurdly early. Robin is reading History Rocks in Alabaster. Crocodile is ranting about Pluton. Clover is screaming Great Kingdom at the world government before getting sniper deleted. Oda has said in multiple interviews he knew the ending, the Void Century mystery, and the meaning of D from the start. These aren't vague vibes. That's intentional scaffolding for an endgame he already pre-wrote. Joy Boy's Fishman Island apology, Noah and Poseidon sit right between foreshadowing and pre-writing. The existence of an ancient promise tied to Fishman Island and the Sea Kings, that feels pre-written. Part of the original Void Century tragedy he built the world around. The specific execution, giant ship named Noah, mermaid princess weapon Poseidon, is where you see the foreshadowing craft. He plants the apology, the ship, and Shirahoshi's role in one arc, but those are fragments of a decision that predates realization. Then you have Nika. This is where retrofitting walks in, tips its hat, and sits down. The early sun motifs, drums, Skypiea silhouettes, rubber silliness, sure, some of that might be soft foreshadowing, but the explicit Hito Hito no Mi, model Nika, the detailed sun god lore, the Gorosei acting shocked, that screams Oda always knew Luffy's fruit was special, but the exact Nika branding and visual language were probably snapped onto older panels later. This is not a sin. This is normal. This is how long serial storytelling survives 25 years of weekly deadlines. Wano's closed borders and the final war prophecies, Odin's journal, Roger laughing at Laughtale, we were too early, are pure pre-writing and delivery. Those scenes read like Oda finally opening the sealed envelope he's been sitting on since the 90s. The D-Clan slots in here too, a pre-written mystery, drip-fed as foreshadowing, with some retrofits along the way whenever a new D-cousin crawls out of the narrative attic. Now, pattern interrupt. Notice what never changes across categories. Whether it's early Void Century setup, later Nika retrofit, or broad Joy Boy pre-writing, the through line is the same. A huge coordinated plan sabotaged by someone with enough power to erase history and lie about it for 800 years. So when you read Joy Boy as betrayed, you're not fighting the text. You're following the spine Oda's been quietly reinforcing from Ohara to Egghead. And going forward, I need you to not just ask what did we learn every chapter, but which bucket does this belong in? Foreshadowing, retrofit, or pre-writing? Because the next Joy Boy reveal isn't just content, it's more evidence for how this author has been building the trap we're all walking into. And once you start sorting clues that way, some very uncomfortable suspects start to emerge. So when those uncomfortable suspects start to emerge, we need to follow that through to the ending. Because if Joy Boy was betrayed, then the finale of One Piece cannot just be Luffy punches Imu so hard the credits roll. That's not a resolution. That's a cool AMV. Here's the thing. Betrayal is a historical crime, not just a combat problem. If Joy Boy was sabotaged, the real final boss isn't Imu's hit points. It's the story the world government wrote afterwards. The Joy Boy failed narrative. The apology on Fishman Island, carved in stone with zero context, as if he just flaked on a promise the way I flake on going to the gym. If that's intentional framing, then the ending has to include a retrial. The charge of failure has to be overturned on screen, so I need you to stop imagining the end game as Marineford 2.0 and start imagining it as Eni's Lobby Plus. Not just a declaration of war, but a declaration of truth. We should be expecting panels where the Void Century is broadcast to the entire world. Not only there was an ancient kingdom, and the D, clan opposed the throne, but here is what Joy Boy actually tried to do with Poseidon, with Noah, with that original mermaid princess. The apology poneglyph becomes Exhibit A in a much bigger case. And once you see that, Fishman Island and Wano stop being side quests and start being foreshadowing for the emotional climax. Fishman Island is literally the crime scene. Joy Boy's broken promise, Noah waiting in dry dock, Shirahoshi inheriting Poseidon's power. Wano is the lock safe, Pluton buried under a closed country, the Kazuki clan carving the records. Joy Boy's attempt gets interrupted. Luffy's version has to be the explicit contrast. The Noah that never moved for Joy Boy finally moves under Luffy's sky. The borders that couldn't open then, open now. Same pieces, different outcome. This is not a sin. This is not Oda retconning Joy Boy into a saint. This is exactly how you write a martyr narrative in a planned long-form story. History as written by Victors says, Joy Boy failed, the ancient kingdom vanished, the world government brought order. History as lived by the oppressed says, Joy Boy was the one person who tried to tear down the ceiling of the sea, and the people in the Holy Land knifed him and then buried the evidence. Joy Boy is the pivot point between those two histories, and the ending has to snap them into alignment. So listen to me. When you read the next batch of chapters, watch how Oda frames Joy Boy's memory. Is he a screw-up Luffy fixes, or a martyr Luffy vindicates? Does the story treat Imu's defeat as victory, or is victory the moment the world hears the real verdict on what happened 800 years ago? That's the lens, and the deeper we get into the final saga, the harder it's going to be to pretend this is just a treasure hunt and not a public exoneration. Because once you accept that, one last very ugly question shows up on the table. If Joy Boy was betrayed, then who exactly carved his apology in stone? And before we start pointing fingers at suspects, I need to point a finger at me and at you. Because if you've been feeling a little attacked by this whole Joy Boy didn't fail, he was betrayed thing, that's intentional. The rant is on purpose. Here's the thing. I'm not mad at you for being wrong. I'm mad on your behalf that this story is doing Olympic-level storytelling and most of the community is watching it through a fogged bathroom mirror. The combative tone is coming from affection. I want you reading One Piece at the level Oda is writing it, not at the level of Twitter panel collage anthropology. So, we need to change how you're engaging with this series, not in a throw away your joy way, in a put on your reading glasses way. I need you to go back to Skypiea, Fishman Island, Wano, and literally reread them with one question in your head. If Joy Boy was betrayed, where does the text accidentally admit it? The moment you swap Joy Boy failed for Joy Boy was sabotaged, the same scenes start doing different work. Fishman Island is the easiest example. You've read that Poneglyph where he apologizes to the mermaid princess for breaking his promise. On a first pass, that reads as incompetence. On a betrayal pass, you pause and ask, who carved this? Who benefits from the world remembering Joy Boy as a tragic screw-up instead of a threat who got knifed in the back? That's not tinfoil. That's basic source criticism. Practically, this means you start building small habits. When you hit a lore dump, you stop speed running it on your way to the punchline. You pause. You ask, who's talking? Who taught them this version of history? Who profits if I believe this? You separate what the character believes from what the narrative is quietly implying. Neptune is not the author. Clover is not the author. The Gorosei definitely are not the author. And this is not a sin. You are still allowed to be a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Joy Boy's shadow in every panel and makes 20-minute videos about how that one random seagull is actually Uranus. This is fine. This is normal. You can enjoy wild theories, memes, crackhead cannons. Just know when you've left textual evidence and entered I'm freestyling in the booth with 0 beats. Label your categories. Because once you start doing that, you're not just a fan consuming content. You're collaborating with the author. You're in the in-group of readers who can tell the difference between foreshadowing, retrofitting, and pure coincidence. You're the person who spots that the Nika fruit keeps evading the world government and goes, "Oh, that's not random. That's a planned pattern in a rigged game." And if you train that muscle now, when we walk into the final war and the story finally names who betrayed Joy Boy, you won't just be surprised. You'll be able to see how Oda built the knife, handed it to them, and let them hold it on panel for 20 years. So here's where we land. When you stack everything we've walked through, the multi-party promise around Noah and Poseidon, the eradicated allies of the ancient kingdom, the censored history on the Poneglyphs, the inherited will of the D-clan, the systematic suppression of Nika, and the way the entire endgame is framed as a rematch of the Void Century, you do not get oops, Joy Boy fumbled. You get a coordinated hit job. Joy Boy did not just fail. Joy Boy was operating in a world that had been intentionally engineered so that his success was functionally impossible. The board was rigged before he ever sat down. The ancient weapons were scattered. The mermaid princess cycle was fragile. The 20 kingdoms were already ready to erase an island off the map for bad vibes. And someone, probably several someones, across factions, made sure the promise to Fishman Island could not be kept. That's not incompetence. That's sabotage. And listen to me. That makes his apology hurt more, not less. The Fishman Island Poneglyph isn't a punchline. It's not Oda going, "Ha ha, goofy ancient guy couldn't keep a promise." It's a wound the story has been slowly stitching up through Luffy's journey. Every time Luffy punches a celestial dragon, drags a fishman out of generational self-hatred, or literally drags the sun back into Wano with Gear 5, he's putting pressure on that scar. The apology is the emotional foreshadowing. Luffy is the payoff. Here's the thing. Once you stop treating Joy Boy as a vague myth and start treating him as the tragic protagonist of a previous act, the whole structure of One Piece snaps into focus. Joy Boy is the Act 1 hero whose revolution got cut off mid-sentence. The Void Century is the missing middle volume your older sibling accidentally threw out. And Luffy, with the same Nika fruit the world government has been terrified of for centuries, is the sequel protagonist inheriting a rigged mission and an unfinished script. We need to be honest about what Oda is doing as an author. This is not a random pile of cool lore. This is planned, intentional storytelling where the categories of failure and betrayal have been quietly swapped. The community keeps saying, Joy Boy failed his promise, because that's the surface text on Fishman Island. But when you add in Emu erasing Lulusia, O'Hara's annihilation, the Gorosei hiding the very word Nika, and the D-clan smiling on the scaffold, the pattern is obvious even to a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast. So here's my verdict, and I need you to carry this with you into your future discussions. Joy Boy didn't fail. Joy Boy was betrayed. His world was rewritten to make that betrayal invisible, and the entire story you're reading is the controlled detonation of that cover-up. This is not a sin to disagree with. This is fine. This is normal critical reading. Treat it not as dogma, but as a lens that actually matches the evidence and the themes Oda is obsessed with. Inheritance, oppression, and unfinished wills. Because when we finally hit the last war and the story names who held the knife, I want you to recognize that moment for what it is. Not just Luffy's climax, but Joy Boy's long-delayed closure. So here's where you come in. I need you to stop letting Joy Boy failed skate by as a throwaway line in this community. Not to start fights, not to ratio strangers, to do the bare minimum of critical reading and say calmly, hold on, that's missing half the story. Because once you've seen the betrayal frame, pretending this was just some goofy mermaid stand-up no-show stops being cute and starts being misinformation. When you see a comment, a TikTok, a thread that just parrots, Joy Boy couldn't keep his promise L, I want you to push back politely but firmly. 1 sentence, 2 sentences, that's it. Hey, remember the promise involved multiple parties, ancient weapons, and a world government that nukes islands to hide history. Calling it Joy Boy failed without nuance is incomplete. You don't have to drop a dissertation. You just have to plant doubt in the lazy narrative. And use this video as your toolbox. Here's the thing. You don't need to memorize every detail. You just need a few sharp examples. Bring up the multi-party promise on Fishman Island. Joy Boy, Poseidon, Noah, the surface migration. Mention how Imu and the Gorosei erase entire nations just to keep the Void Century buried. Point to the inherited will structure we walked through, D-Clan, Ancient Kingdom, Nika Fruit, as evidence that the author intentionally wrote Joy Boy's failure as a rigged game, not a skill issue. I need you to actually talk about this. In the comments here, drop your favourite piece of evidence for the betrayal reading. Is it the Poneglyph being an apology instead of a confession? The way the world government treats Nika as a virus, not a meme? The Roger/Odin reaction at Laugh-Tale? Or do you have a good counter-argument, some foreshadowing I'm underweighting, that really does support the he just blew it category? Put it down. Argue it out. This channel is for high-effort one-piece discourse, not drive-by panel spam. And if you want homework, because apparently you watched a video this long on foreshadowing for fun, re-watch or reread some arcs with friends and turn this into a game. Dressrosa, Fishman Island, Skypiea, Wayno. Every time you see a Joy Boy, Nika, or Void Century hint, stop and classify it. Is this foreshadowing, retrofitting, or pre-writing? This is not a sin. This is not exam prep. This is literally you training your brain to see how intentional, long-form storytelling actually works. Pattern interrupt. Do this out loud, in person. Touch grass, then touch the manga. Argue over whether the Noah ship is pre-written setup or a retrofit. Debate if Shirahoshi's role as Poseidon proves Joy Boy was sabotaged or just overambitious. This is fine. This is normal. And to those of you still here at the end of this rant, you are no longer casual fans skimming the wanted posters. You're the weirdos who actually read the Poneglyphs. So next time someone shrugs and says Joy Boy failed, you know what to do. Correct them. Gently, relentlessly, because Joy Boy didn't fail. He was betrayed, and we need to stop telling the story there